Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome to the latest episode of the Hard Compound Live. For those of you who don't know, my name's Rich and I run and operate the Hard Compound. We're a one-stop shop for all things motorsport, and we can be found on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram primarily, and these videos can also be found on our YouTube channel. So give us a search on any of those platforms and come and join in the fun. We are here to share a love of motorsport. That's all. We put out 3 written articles a day on Facebook, and these are followed in shorter form on our Twitter and our Instagram. These are morning, lunchtime, and evening here in the UK. And these take the form of race reviews, race previews, throwbacks, birthdays, breaking news, our favourite liveries on this day, posts, and anything we can shake a stick at, really. And we cover everything from Formula One to touring cars, IndyCar, NASCAR, bikes, rallying, and everything else in between to the best of our abilities. In case you hadn't noticed, we also do live video interviews, just like this one. And just like this one, these are streamed on our Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube only. They're also automatically saved in the video section on Facebook and in the live section on our YouTube. We've done well over 100 of these. We've had some marvelous guests. I won't name them all, but we've had guests from all across the motorsport spectrum. We've had like racers past and present. We've had the honour and the privilege of speaking with people such as Mario Andretti and Jackie Ickx. We've spoken with Hans Stuck, with Brian Redman, with Frank Durney, Mike Wilds, Carl Wendlinger, Ari Leyendijk, Danny Sullivan, Willie T. Ribbs, Eddie Cheever, Derek Warwick, Stefan Johansson, Mark Blundell, Derek and Connor Daly, Karen Chandhok, and many, many, many others. So do go and check them out in the video section on Facebook, the live section on our YouTube, but don't do it just yet because we have a fabulous guest this evening, someone that I'm very, very, very excited to speak with. I've been describing him this week as a royalty in the motorsports journalistic and broadcasting world, and I'm sure you'll all agree. He was the voice of Formula One on BBC Radio and for ITV. He's an author, a journalist, a historian, and what he doesn't know about motorsport isn't worth knowing. So we're going to bring him in right now. It's an absolute honour to welcome Mr. Simon Taylor.
Hello, Rich. Good evening. Good evening to all those people out there.
Good evening, Simon. Well, firstly, how are you? And thank you very much for coming on and doing this.
Well, it's good to be here. I'm fit and well and trundling on doing what I love to do, which is still writing. Still talking to motor clubs, still presenting evenings at the RAC, doing all the kind of stuff that I've always done.
Which is lovely to hear, and it's absolutely fabulous that you're still involved with motorsport. Obviously, there's so many of us who've been so familiar with you over the last few years. Firstly, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to ambush you at Brooklands on the evening with Mr. Derek Warwick, which was a great evening, absolutely superbly hosted by yourself. So, yeah, thank you very much for talking to me and for agreeing to come on. I'm very grateful. Right, okay, just before we press on, guys in the comment section, whichever platform you're tuning in on, do type in any comments that you have or any questions. We'll work them in as best we can. As you can imagine, there's a lot to cover, which we'll do our best to do. I can see there's some people in the comments already. Keith Mayo, good evening. Our friend Nikki from near the Nürburgring is in. Vitolda Marasevska, Mike Cole, Oliver Taylor, John Cavill tuning in from Florida. Good evening, John. Very good to hear from you again, sir. I can see Simon smiling with John Cavill. We know John. So, guys, yes, do put your comments in, and we'll do our best to answer any questions that you have got at an opportune time. Right, that's the intro done. I think it's best that we press on. Obviously, Simon, you've told us what you're up to recently, but if I may, what I'd like to do is go right back to the very start and where your interest in motorsport came from. How did it all start for you?
Well, I think the days when I was born, it was pretty normal for kids, young boys, to be excited by motor cars. It isn't really anymore. It's not an automatic thing that a 4, 5, 6-year-old gets excited by cars. They're into other things. But in the late 40s, when I first appeared, motor cars were something that kids loved. They loved railway trains, which were still then partly steam, but they also loved motor cars. And for whatever reason, I just always loved cars. My mother used to complain that my first word wasn't mummy, it was car. And really, right from the beginning, I have always been fascinated by cars. Of course, to start with, it was really road cars. And when I was first around, there was petrol rationing. It was almost impossible to buy new cars. And if you saw any car that was new or interesting, it was quite. I grew up in the West Country, in a small West Country town. And if a new car, even if it was a Morris Oxford, drove down the street, you would get pretty excited. And if you were lucky enough on a very rare occasion to see a Jaguar XK120, well, then that would be a matter of extreme excitement. I was lucky that my parents, they weren't particularly motorsport mad, but when I became mad on cars, they kind of indulged me. We had a local circuit, Castle Combe, which of course is still going. That was our nearest track. And the first time I went to a motor race was on Easter Saturday, 1952. That's going to, if you work it out, show how old I am. But at that first race meeting that I went to, there was a Formula 3 race, which was won by one Stirling Moss. And you have to imagine what racetracks were like then. It was a disused wartime aerodrome, not like Goodwood was. It had a little perimeter track, and it was the perimeter track that they were using as the racetrack. It was raining, of course, and there was a substantial crowd, and the crowd was standing by the side of the track with just one piece of string holding them back. We were on Quarry Corner, which still exists at Castle Combe, those of you who know the track. And of course, if a car had gone in the wrong direction, we probably all would have been mown down. But I thought it was absolutely wonderful. And I continued to go to small local events because I persuaded my parents to take me. And then in 1956, on Easter Monday, I went to Goodwood for the first time. Goodwood used to have, when it was a working major circuit, it would have 8 or more race meetings a year, some of them international races. But on Easter Monday, every year, it would have its major race meeting, which would include a Formula 1 race. You have to remember that in those days, Formula 1 didn't just mean the Grand Prix that counted towards the World Championship. There would be lots of other Formula 1 races also. And Formula 1 teams, Ferrari, BRM, whoever it might be, would go to these non-championship Formula 1 races. And on Easter Monday 1956, I saw a Formula 1 race which included Stirling Moss and the 250F Maserati. It included Mike Hawthorne in the new 4-cylinder BRM. It included a wonderful man who became my hero that day, called Archie Scott Brown.
Yes.
Archie Scott Brown's mother got German measles when he was, before he was born, when she was pregnant with him. And as a result, he was born with his feet pointing in the wrong direction and with one of his arms malformed. And his torso was that of a 6-foot man, but from his waist downwards, his legs were very short, so he was actually only about 5 feet high. And one of his arms didn't have a hand.
Yeah, it was just past the elbow, wasn't it? I think, wasn't it?
That's right. And you wouldn't expect a man like that to be any good as a racing driver. Well, he had endless operations during his youth, which managed to turn his feet round to point them in the right direction. But he still didn't walk very well. But it's a measure of the man's intense competitive nature that when there was a Le Mans start, which you remember was where you would have a sports car race where all the cars were lined up in echelon on one side of the track and the drivers were on the other side. And when the flag fell, they ran to their cars. And Archie was always first into his car. I don't know how he did it, but he always was. And he drove, he would have the seat of his car at a kind of angle because, of course, he had a normal length left arm, and he would change gear. Always had to have a centre gear change, but he would change gear with his left hand, and he would lean with his stump on the steering wheel to steady himself while he changed gear. And his car control in the wet was absolutely unbelievable. He was incredibly quick. And I think because of all the difficulties he's had as a small child, I mean, learning to walk must have been very difficult for him. I remember Brian Lister, who built the Lister Jaguars that Archie Scott and Brian raced with such success. He said, one of the extraordinary things about Archie Scott Brian was I don't know if ever at school you had a slow bicycle race where everybody lines up on a bicycle, and without stopping, you have to keep going, but the last person to get the finish line is the winner. So you're on a bicycle, barely moving and trying not to fall over. And Archie Scott Brown, as a kid at school, always won the slow bicycle race because his balance was so extraordinary. And going back to that race on Easter Monday in 1956, Hawthorne in the new BRM led the race, but turned over at Fordwater because a rear wheel collapsed. He was very lucky not to be killed, but he was unhurt. But Archie Scott Brown in a humble Connaught. Now, the Connaught, for those of you who don't remember this, I'm sorry, I'm going back into primitive early history with these stories, but
no, go for it.
A little under-financed British team that made little Formula One cars. The engine was basically out of a Lee Francis. There was no way that a Connaught should have been competitive with a Maserati 250F, particularly if Stirling Moss was driving the Maserati. But Archie Scott Brown led Moss for much of the race.
Wow.
And it was the first time I'd seen a motor racing crowd stand up and shout. I mean, rather like a Dutch crowd cheering on Verstappen today. Everybody was yelling, "Come on, Archie." And he led Moss until finally the engine went off. Moss went ahead. And then Scott Brown's engine finally expired in a cloud of smoke, and he stopped on the grass verge below our grandstand. And I saw this little man get out, and with his one good arm, he got a packet of cigarettes out of his racing overalls, popped a cigarette into his mouth, got a box of matches, and was able to strike a match. Had the matches in his racing overalls, of course. He was able to strike a match with his one good hand, light up the cigarette, and he sat there watching the race, smoking his fag. And then at the end of the race, which Moss won, Stirling stopped on his slowing down lap, and rather in the way that Nigel Mansell did for Ayrton Senna eons later, Moss gave Archie a lift back to the pits, and Archie was spread-eagled over the fuel tank of the Maserati 250F with his one hand hanging on to the fuel filler and everybody cheering. I mean, that's just one little story of the sort of thing that lit my fire during my childhood as I got more and more interested in motor racing. I was able to borrow or snaffle motor magazines when they were thrown away, so that I read endlessly magazines which were a week or a month or more old, but I consumed all those. And when you're a kid and you're passionate about something, I mean, it may now be some kid who is passionate about football or whatever it might be, you soak up these facts and you remember them. And there's nothing particularly clever or remarkable about being able to remember lots of detail about motor racing. Don't ask me what I had for breakfast this morning because I won't be able to tell you. But ask me about a motor race in the 50s or the 60s or even in the 70s, and I'll bore the pants off you, as I just have with my Archie Scott Brown story. I'll bore the pants off you, telling you the most minute details.
I just love that. It's that era of what I guess people of my age would call the like gentleman driver. You know, just going out racing because they love racing and they're good at it. And I just love it having a packet of cigarettes and some matches in. Just in case. Just in case you don't make it to the finish and you can enjoy it with a smoke. That's absolutely wonderful. And what an introduction to motorsport that is. It's absolutely wonderful. And just quickly, you mentioned about Lister. It's just put something in my brain there. I was actually one of my wife's friends lives out in Palma, out in Mallorca, and she's met a guy from South Africa out there who works out there, and they got married. And for 2 or 3 years, I knew that his surname was Lister, and it never even entered my head that there might be some kind of a link. And I think it was his great uncle or something either founded the company or was the founder of it. And when he mentioned it, I couldn't believe that I hadn't thought of it. I was like, how on earth did I not twig that?
There are these links, aren't there? Yeah.
So wonderful. That's fantastic though. And so obviously it was after seeing something like that and other stories, as you've mentioned, it was inevitable that you were perhaps going to be somehow involved in motorsport. Having had that start, I've just seen in the comment section, someone's just said that they completely get it. They had the same thing with Derek Warwick back in '82 and said it just lights the fire, doesn't it? Absolutely.
Well, the races you see when you're a kid, that is really what does, as you say, light the fire. I was tremendously lucky, and so much in life is about luck. If you happen to be in the right time, in the right place at the right time. And I left school, went to university. I did some kart racing when I was 17. I had the cheapest, most battered third-hand kart, which I took around in a little Austin van. And I never really thought that I was going to be a racing driver. I just wanted to have fun. I never had any illusions, So many people at that age, they think, I want to become a Formula One driver. I want to be Ayrton Senna. I want to be Lewis Hamilton. I never had any illusions about my ability. I hoped I was going to be able to do some motorsport for fun, which is what I've been lucky enough to be able to do. But while I was at university, there was a university motor club, the Cambridge University Automobile Club, which had been going since Edwardian times. And we used to run little sprints at Snetterton, which was the nearest track. I managed to buy for 600 quid an AC Ace, which I still have. I sold it because I hadn't got any money to keep it going. I sold it after about 3 years. The car disappeared, found it in Hong Kong, bought it back for unfortunately more than 600 quid, and the car was restored. It's now something I hope I shall have forever. But I competed in little sprints at Snetterton, the university club, and I decided that there should be a report of this event in Autosport. So Autosport in those days, sadly, Formula One has demolished so much of the media's interest or understanding in club sport.
Yes.
And if we've got time, I can tell you why I think that's a shame. And
of course.
Club motorsport is still so important. But anyway, I decided to send a report into Autosport of this little event. They used to have a bit at the back of the magazine where they had little reports and little events. They published it. They paid me 2 guineas. Probably don't know what a guinea is, but a guinea was £1, 1 shilling, which is £1 and 5p. So I was paid 2 of those. And they said, if you've got anything else, you can send it along. So I then, during the university vacation, if I went to a Castle Crew meeting, I started to report those. So I became a kind of little amateur race reporter.
Yeah, like a little freelance type thing.
And then the week I was leaving university, I had actually lined up a fairly respectable job. But as I was about to accept this respectable job, I had a phone call from the young club editor on Autosport, who'd been the man that I'd sent my copy into. He was my contact in the magazine. And he rang me up and he said, look, I've just told the boss of the magazine, it was a man called Gregor Grant, who'd started the magazine in the 1950s. I'll slightly alter the language of what he told me he'd said, but he said, I just told Gregor Grant to get knotted, and he's fired me. And therefore, if you apply for a job on Autosport today, before they've had a chance to advertise the job, who knows, you might get it.
Right.
So I wrote a letter that afternoon. You didn't send emails, hadn't been invented. You wrote letters, you put them in an envelope, you put a stamp on. So I sent a letter, and the assistant editor of the magazine was a man called Paddy McNally, who later became the 50% shareholder of one of Bernie Ecclestone's companies, which was then sold for £300 million. So he no longer needed to earn money as a journalist. But anyway, he gave me the job. There I was sitting on Autosport as the most junior. We only had a staff of 4. The magazine was produced from a scruffy second floor room over a pornographic bookshop in Paddington.
Wow.
There we were working away, and there was no money. The magazine was kind of teetering. This was Autosport. I mean, a magazine loved by everyone in motorsport, but it wasn't making any money. And it was teetering on the edge of disaster permanently. You were always quite pleased when you got your wage packet on Thursday afternoon.
Yes.
And one day I was sitting at my desk. This was in about 1967. As I say, I was the editorial junior, but I was terribly keen, so I was always in the office first thing before anybody else. And a tall man with a mane of blonde hair walked into my office. And with all the arrogance of youth, I said, who the hell are you and what are you doing in my office? And he said, my name is Michael Heseltine, and I've just bought you. And this was Michael Heseltine, later to become Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, it was.
Now Lord Heseltine, he's still going, he's over 90. And he was trying to set up a magazine publishing company.
Right.
And the way he decided to do it was by going all over the country, trying to find loss-making magazines, which he could then take over and put in one building and try and make them make a profit. All the other staff of Autosport promptly left because they said, we don't want this horrible man looking after us. And so overnight, age 23, I went from editorial junior to editor.
Wow.
So at the age of 23, I found myself editing Autosport, which is about the loveliest job you could possibly have. I mean, it's somebody else's expense. You're going to Grand Prix, you're going to Le Mans, you're driving road test cars. You're even, if you manage to talk your way into it, you're track testing. I ended up track testing Formula One cars. I track tested, do you remember that Lotus made a Formula One turbine car, Lotus 56B? It was actually originally a car built for Indianapolis. It was then adapted for Formula One. And it wasn't a success in Formula One for a couple of reasons. One is a turbine-driven car has no engine braking, and the brakes were never good enough for the car. But anyway, I persuaded Lotus to let me track test this thing, and so I'm the only journalist to have driven the Lotus turbine Formula One car. You just had a wonderful time. You worked 7 days a week and 7 nights a week. No mobile phones, no computers. The fax machine had barely been invented. Does anyone remember what a fax machine is?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that was about the only way you could get stuff around. I mean, I could bore the pants off you telling
Wow.
stories about what it was like putting together every week a motor racing magazine with reports coming not only from Oulton Park and Castle Combe, but also from all over Europe, from Can-Am races in America, from a race in Japan. No computers, no emails.
Yeah.
Stuff used to arrive in an envelope with a roll of film, no digital cameras then. You'd get somebody had written you a report, put a roll of film in the envelope, and you had to turn that around. It was tremendous fun. And I did that for about 5 years. Haymarket was then expanding, becoming quite a substantial company. I loved being an editor, but said to Michael Heseltine's number 2, look, I'm having a lovely time, but I'd quite like to get married and I'd quite like to become a normal human being. And you are going to have to pay me more than 78p a week. And he said, well, if you want to get paid more, you can't be an editor anymore because editors are cheap. You're going to have to be a publisher. And so I kind of got kicked upstairs. And instead of editing Autosport every week, I then had to run a chunk of the company, think of new magazines to publish. I launched something. It occurred to me, because in those days when there was no internet, if you wanted to buy a new car, where the hell did you get the information? No, just go online and look at them all. And I invented a magazine called What Car?
What Car, yeah.
Which it's not a terribly exciting magazine, but it served a need. It did incredibly well. It became the biggest selling car magazine in the country. And with the profits that made, we were then able to launch other magazines. We launched a magazine just about Formula One called F1 Racing, which was kind of quite a new idea then. We launched a magazine about classic cars because I loved and still do love old cars. And we launched a magazine. It wasn't the first classic car magazine. It was probably about the second, but it was called Classic and Sports Car. And that's now been going for over 40 years and is the biggest selling classic car magazine in the country. We did all sorts of mad things, and what you would do in publishing is that you had to have about 10 ideas a week for new magazines, and 8 of them were so silly you'd throw them in the waste paper basket.
Sure.
One of them you'd go with, and it would be a disaster and would lose you lots of money. And you'd hope one of them would work and eventually wash its face and start to be profitable. And I love magazine publishing. It meant that during that period, when I'd left Autosport and I wasn't going to races every weekend, of course I missed going to races. So the only answer there was to talk my way into being a radio commentator. I got the BBC to let me commentate on Formula One races, and I would fly off on Friday evening. I'd leave my desk at Haymarket, fly off on Friday evening to wherever the Grand Prix was, cover the Grand Prix on Saturday and Sunday, leave the Grand Prix on Sunday night and be back in the office doing my proper job on Monday. So it was bad, but it was enormous fun.
I was going to say, that's a hectic but wonderful way to make a living, isn't it? I absolutely love that. I was just thinking as you were saying there, you know, with the current, I don't want to make myself sound old, I'm only in my early 40s, but the current generation is sort of teenagers and into the early 20s. I wonder if we went back, just for one season, went back to doing things with envelopes and rolls of film and fax things, how they would cope with not knowing what's going on. Because obviously everything's at the touch of a button now. You've got the whole world at your fingertips.
That's
It would
right.
be absolute bedlam. I think it would all be absolutely crazy. I've just seen a comment here from Oliver Taylor. Evening, Ollie. It says Autosport was the very best magazine, and it's all he would read as a child. Much to my teacher's disbelief, as I was always the strongest reader in my class. Not sure I would have been as good a reader with today's F1 centric pamphlet.
You were probably reading my rubbish. Yeah. Well, there we go.
It served him well.
Becoming a commentator was just a huge privilege. And I mean, all the time I've done all these silly things, I've always had to pinch myself to make sure that it's real, because I've always just felt I'm so lucky and I'm so privileged to be able to go to Grand Prix as I did from the 1970s onwards. Once again, you have to understand how different things were then. Formula One was not this huge global billion-dollar sport then. It didn't have an enormous television audience. It didn't have a soap opera on Netflix about it. None of that. And because of that, Formula One was quite a kind of small parish. And if you were a driver, a team owner, a mechanic, a journalist, a commentator, you all travelled on the same aeroplanes, no private jets then. You probably stayed at all the same hotels. The drivers were friendly. They weren't being paid £250,000 a week. Sterling always used to say that he earned at the height of his career about the same as a good barrister or a good surgeon would earn. And he said, I thought I was doing bloody well at that, boy.
Sure.
Different times. But that meant that the drivers were friendly, they were approachable. When it got to the point where the drivers knew that you were kind of on side and you weren't just simply going to write anything that they said, they could trust you, they could talk privately to you and know that you weren't instantly going to publish it or spout it on the radio.
That's some trust.
And we really got very close to these guys. And I got to know a lot of drivers extremely well. They were my friends. And of course, motor racing was very, very dangerous in those days. Drivers got killed quite a lot. I knew Bruce McLaren. He wrote, he didn't actually write it. There was a column in Autosport by Bruce McLaren almost every week. It's actually ghostwritten by a New Zealand journalist, Ian Young, who was a chum of his. But so Bruce was a good friend, lovely man. I knew Jochen Rindt quite well. I particularly knew Piers Courage well because I got to know him in the Formula 3 and Formula 2 days. He was a wonderful man. Well, there you had three Formula One drivers, top Formula One drivers. Bruce McLaren was killed in May.
That was Goodwood, wasn't it?
Goodwood. Piers Courage was killed in June, maybe the beginning of July.
That was at Zandvoort.
Yeah, Frank Williams was running a Tabata. He was killed. And then in September, Jochen Rindt was killed. So you've got three top Formula One drivers being killed in a matter of about 3 months.
Yeah.
Jochen Rindt, as you
won the
World Championship posthumously that year.
Yeah.
And it wasn't only the Formula One drivers that were getting killed. It was also club drivers, drivers in sports car races, drivers in Formula 2. And during 1970, I think this was before Jochen was killed. It was after Piers Courage was killed. I wrote a leader in the editorial column in Autosport, and I counted up all the drivers who'd been killed that year up to July, including rally drivers, club racers who'd gone off at Rougheth and hit a marshal's post and so on. And I think it was 17 people. I got quite used to getting a phone call on Sunday evening and saying, I'm afraid so-and-so's not on with us, and I would have to sit down and write an obituary. on Sunday evening. It sort of happened too often. And even later, I mean, I will never forget, we're now going forward into a much more recent era. I will never forget commentating for the BBC on radio at Imola, it would have been 1994, I think,
Yeah.
when Ayrton Senna was killed. And it was extraordinary because Murray, my dear friend Murray, who was doing the TV, was in the next booth, and we were both talking away, and this accident happened, and everything went quiet. And we knew something awful had happened. And it was impossible to get any information. The Italian TV cameras were just endlessly zooming in on this Williams in the barrier.
Yeah.
And I was longing for the people on Radio 5 Live who I was talking to say, the producer saying to my ear, okay, look, nothing's happening, wind up and we'll go to the cricket. But they didn't. Murray was able to get our grandstand that he was doing it for.
Yes.
They realised that something terrible had happened. And so Murray was able to wind up and they went to some other sport. But I will never forget sitting in the commentary box, having to talk in this kind of silence when all the cars had stopped. We knew Ayrton Senna was dead, in fact, for all sorts of legal reasons. They said he died in the helicopter because in Italy there are strange rules about if somebody dies at an event, everybody is liable.
If like someone dies on property somewhere, then there's a whole lot. Yeah.
And anyway, it was, and I mean, Ayrton being killed, it was cataclysmic. I mean, when we finally got away, we had the race, commentated on the race, did my wrap-ups, had to do a couple of extra news pieces for the Today programme on Radio 4 in the morning because it was a big news story. And when we got to the airport very late, all the planes had all been upset by this. Everything had gone upside down. And I finally remember I got back to my house in Chiswick at 3 a.m. This house where I am now, I remember arriving, getting out of the taxi. And it was 3 a.m. and there was an ITV news team, camera and lights, waiting in my front garden because they were so desperate for more news. They were looking for people to talk to who'd been there. It was a terrible day. Roland Ratzenberger had been killed the day before.
Yeah.
And
we had the accident with Rubens on the Friday as well, of course.
Rubens had a terrible accident on Friday. I got there on Friday night. I saw Rubens on Saturday, and he said, I said to him, for God's sake, how it was a huge accident. He said, no, I'm all right. I'm good. He was very bruised and so on, but he didn't do the race. Then Roland Ratzenberger, whom I didn't actually know, he was killed on the Saturday. And by then, by 1994, people weren't getting killed so often.
I think Roland was the first one since Elio De Angelis, wasn't he? In '86, I think, was the first. He was the first for a couple of years.
Interestingly, Ayrton was completely knocked sideways by this.
Right.
Ayrton regarded himself, justifiably, I suppose, as the kind of top man in Formula One. He felt on his shoulders the whole good of Formula One was held. And he was very friendly, very close to a wonderful man who I'm sure you've heard of, Sid Watkins, Prof. Watkins. He was the Formula One doctor. And Prof was a lovely man. I knew him very well. He was very good to me in a quite different way, which is off the subject. But Prof told me all of this years later. Ayrton went to Prof on the Sunday morning of the San Marino Grand Prix, Roland Ratzenberger having been killed the previous day. And Ayrton said to Prof, I don't want to do this anymore. I just don't want to do it. The Prof said, for God's sake, Ayrton, if that's how you feel, don't do it. You must stop. stop and we'll go fishing. Ayrton used to go up to Scotland and stay with Prof and go fishing. They loved fishing. And Prof said, don't do it. Ayrton said, well, I can't stop now. Contracts, sponsors, business, I can't stop. But that's how Ayrton was feeling that day. He was not in a good place.
Yeah.
So the whole thing was just, it was a horrible weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine what it was like being there. And I remember I was actually at a friend's birthday party. We were turning 13 at the time, and we'd heard that Roland had died on the Saturday. And on the Sunday, I remember seeing the accident, and obviously being 13, I didn't really. I thought, oh, that's serious. And I remember saying to my dad, why is no one going to him, to Ayrton? Because he was in the car and slumped, and he just said, oh, I don't know. And he distracted me with something. And then I remember the news breaking that evening. I think it was Moira Stewart I think it was, broke it. And they said he died. And I remember getting a bit emotional with talking about it. My mum, when they said that Ayrton had died, my mum just went, no, not Senna. I remember her saying, no, not Senna. And I turned and went, Mum? And she looked at me and kind of nodded. And apparently I just ran upstairs and cried for 3 hours.
It was the most dreadful happening because he was kind of indubitably the best. And April the 7th, 1968 was just like that, because Jim Clark was in a class of his own. Jim Clark was extraordinary. He was a very quiet, self-effacing, courteous, polite man, a very nice man. He was quite, when he wasn't in the cockpit, he was quite unsure of himself. He used to bite his nails. He was just the antithesis of a racing driver.
Yeah, never seemed quite comfortable, almost.
Yeah, but then once he got in the cockpit,
he was.
I remember a race at Spa, where, of course, typically at Spa it rained.
Yes.
In practice, and he started, I think, 8th on the grid, and he was leading as they were going up the hill from Eau Rouge.
Wow!
And he won the race by some huge margin, 4 minutes or something absurd. And it was only after the race that we discovered that he had a gearbox problem, and he'd had to drive in the teeming rain.
Yes.
With one hand holding the gear lever, holding the car in gear with the other. Now, on April the 7th, 1968, he was doing an insignificant Formula 2 race at Hockenheim. And there was a problem with the car. I think he was only lying in 7th place, and the race car, it didn't really matter. And in a totally unexplained accident, we now think it was a puncture, he went off into the trees and he was killed. And you thought, even in those days when lots of people got killed, Jim Clark, you thought, well, he's invincible. It wouldn't happen to him. And
that was my thinking with Ayrton. Obviously, not to belittle Roland, nobody would ever do that. But as I've said, this was Senna. It was Superman. I said that my friends liked all the Marvel comics, and I've always said that their superheroes wore capes. I said mine wore crash helmets.
Well, we mentioned.
I imagine Jim Clark was the same. That kind of seismic.
We mentioned Murray Walker earlier, and I can't miss the opportunity to talk about Murray, because he was a very dear friend of mine, and he went through this extraordinary period when he was kind of, by the end of his commentating career, he was adored. He was a kind of national icon. But he did go through this period where he was disliked by a lot of enthusiasts. I'm talking now about the early 60s into the 70s. They didn't like his strident voice. They thought, before Murray Walker, commentators like Raymond Baxter were much more upper middle class and spoke in rather quiet tones, and it was rather, motor race commentary sounded rather like a cricket commentary. And Murray changed all that.
Yeah.
And in fact, Murray, which people didn't realise at first, Murray was incredibly skillful and incredibly knowledgeable and an incredibly hard worker. When we used to arrive at a Grand Prix, we used to fly in usually on a Thursday afternoon. All the drivers, all the journalists, we'd all be on one plane, everybody misbehaving and laughing and so on. And then when we get to the airport, we'd all get our hire cars, we'd queue up at the Hertz and Avis desks and give the girl their terrible time. And then we'd get in our hire cars and we'd go back to the hotel and get unpacked and shower and so on. But not Murray. Murray would get into his hire car and go to the track. This is Thursday afternoon. And with a big foolscap pad and a pen, he would walk a lap, writing down also where the camera positions were, which advertising hoardings were where, so that you would immediately identify them. He didn't do it at the Nürburgring. At the Nürburgring, he drove around in his hire car.
He would have had to arrive on the Monday.
In his commentary box, he would have bits of paper stuck up all over the commentary box, and he would be there on the balls of his feet, raring to go half an hour before the race began. James Hunt, who, as you remember, was his co-commentator for many years, James was completely different. Murray was always well turned out. He would wear a tweed jacket and a tie, and usually his BRDC tie, because he'd become a member of the BRDC for all the good work he'd done. And James would probably, if it was warm, he'd be wearing a cut-down pair of shorts and a scruffy old T-shirt and flip-flops. And he would appear in the commentary box with 2 minutes to go, carrying a bottle of white wine. And the bottle of white wine would be put down by his chair, and it would be empty by the end of the race. And Murray would be standing up, commentating excitedly. James would be next to him, slumped in his chair. But whatever James said was so sharp and so an incredible pair. But to start with, the producer at BBC Television, a chap called Jonathan Martin, had terrible problems because he couldn't stop them interrupting each other. And in the end, the only way he could make it work was he gave them one microphone between them. So if James wanted to talk, he had to snatch the microphone from Murray. And then when Murray wanted to say it, he had to snatch it back. And in those days, I used to do the radio commentary for the BBC. But if there was an occasion when Murray was elsewhere, I mean, he still used to do the motorcycle Grand Prix, for example, I would do the television with James. And it was an extraordinary experience because, I mean, James was wonderful to commentate with. But of course, you had to get used to him grabbing the microphone while you were in mid-go. I'll give you one last little Murray story.
No, please do.
Murray and James always had this slightly difficult relationship because Murray's approach was so strictly professional, James was so laid back. And James used to turn up, as I say, at the last minute. But at the Belgian Grand Prix one year, 2 minutes to go, cars on the grid, no James. Race starts, still no James. Murray had to do the whole commentary on his own. James just never turned up. And they were staying Sunday night at Spa, and so Monday morning, breakfast time, James wanders down to breakfast. Morning, Murray. And Murray says, "Where the hell were you yesterday?" And James said, "Oh, sorry, Murray, I was in bed with a throat infection." Murray said, "That's the first time I've heard 2 Belgian nurses being referred to as a throat infection."
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's amazing. I mean, that wasn't even that long ago, and it was just again just such a different world. But I just love. I mean, I want to come to James a little bit later on with film Rush and everything that you were in, but um, I I mean, I'm sure you look back on it the same way as I do. Obviously, you were there and everything, but I always look back on James and Murray with a lot of affection. There was I shan't repeat what James said, but it was about like Rene Arnoux in Monaco, and James
Oh
was
yes, I remember that.
most cutting about that. And I remember being on TV, and my again, I was about 11 or 12, and my father just went, just like made a noise and covered it. And,
They get away with murder. That's absolutely true. But by the end, Murray and James did have a good relationship because there was a lot of mutual respect. But Murray, if you listen now to Murray's commentaries, you realise that actually there's an enormous amount of knowledge and an enormous amount of hard work behind them. And okay, he made the famous Murrayisms, but actually, if you count up the billions of words that Murray must have spoken over 50 years of commentating, well, okay, out of those billions, maybe there were a few hundred that were wrong, but most of the time he was absolutely spot on.
that's the thing, isn't it? It's the things that go wrong that people remember, but we just love him for it. And I think, I mean, everyone's got their favourites with Murray, but mine wasn't a Murrayism. It was his response to them. He got referred to as, you make errors, and he said, "I don't make errors. I make prophecies that immediately turn out to be wrong." And I just thought it was just the perfect response. It was a wonderful thing.
I mean, just before he died, I used to talk to him on the phone, but by the end, he was in a care home. I mean, he was well into his 90s, and I used to phone him up occasionally. And his voice, that strident voice, was absolutely unchanged. And he was still watching Grand Prix in the care home and kind of shouting at the screen and saying, "No, he's not going to," he couldn't stop. He was lucky.
Just couldn't help himself. I love that right until the last few days, which is Murray was being Murray. I'm just having a very quick scroll through the comments here. I've seen a few coming in. Yeah, we've got like tug of microphone, things like that. We mentioned about Ed when I was talking about Ayrton Senna. We've got Marion Speed. She said that she cried when she heard about Ronnie Peterson. We'll come to Ronnie shortly as well. And someone else is saying that they used to sit eagerly by the front door waiting for the copy of Autosport to come through. Scouring for mentions of my favourite drivers or race reports from the races I had attended. Yes, I did enjoy my dad coming home with Autosport. That was lovely. One thing I do want to touch on, we're going to come back to the commentary stuff in a bit. One thing I did want to ask you about was something I believe happened a bit later. Your Lunch With series, absolutely superb. And I want to come on to some memories of some other drivers as well. But I've read a couple of bits about the Lunch With series and the things behind that. And there's a few that I wanted to ask you about. Because the first one was with Max Mosley, wasn't it?
It was. The way Lunch With started, funnily enough, I'd known Max forever because I've had a pretty spasmodic and inglorious motor racing career myself. Only in the odd weekends between Grand Prix when nobody was looking. And I raced a Clubman's car in the late 60s. And Max Mosley, this is before he went into Formula 2. He did race in Formula 2 for a while. But Max Mosley was in Clubman's Formula at the same time as me. So I knew him since the 60s. And then when he set up March, I was then editing Autosport. So I was very close to the launch of March and so on. So I carried on knowing him, and he was an extraordinary man. Lots of people have good reasons for disliking him and disapproving of him, all of which I understand. But I liked him enormously. He was very clever. He was very witty. He had an extraordinarily ingenious brain. And he was also, although he was no respecter of persons, and if he thought you were stupid, he would tell you. But funnily enough, he did have a kind of moral compass. The thing that mattered to him most of all when he was president of the FIA was the work he did for road safety, and he did do a lot to make our roads and our cars safer, and he took that terribly seriously. But my lunch with, he was then the president of the FIA. He was living in Monaco, and the editor of Motorsport, which Haymarket was publishing in those days, said we ought to have an interview with Max Mosley because he's saying all this stuff about being president of the FIA, and you better go and talk to him. So I rang him up and said, look, can I come to Monaco and talk to you for a couple of hours? And he said, yes, we can go and have lunch at that cafe in the Casino Square, which we did. And the editor of the magazine, when he put the interview to press, called it Lunch with Max Mosley. And then the following month, I found that there was somebody else that I should interview, and that became Lunch With. And the Lunch With series lasted for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I actually called a halt because they were very successful, those interviews, and people liked them very much. And I'd done 126 of them.
Wow.
And I was concerned to keep the standard high.
Right.
And I'd had lunch with pretty much all the people that I thought were interesting enough to do a big interview with. And I thought, well, now I should stop before they start to be less important and less interesting. What was great was that I said nowadays, most magazines, most newspapers, most websites, because people's attention spans are shorter, articles, features, news stories, they've all become much shorter.
Yeah.
When I did those interviews, I said to the editor of Motorsport, for most of the time, it was a wonderful man called Damien Smith, who is still connected with the magazine, but also is the sports editor of Autocar these days.
Yes.
And I said to him, if we're going to do an interview, and it's going to say anything different from all the other interviews, if I go and talk to Mario Andretti has been interviewed countlessly over the last 40 years.
Yep.
The only way I can really do a fresh and important interview with Mario Andretti is to say to him, look, I'm going to fly to Nazareth, Pennsylvania. I'm going to take you out to lunch, but you must promise to give me 3 hours.
Right.
And, nowadays, if you want to go and interview Lewis Hamilton, you will not get him for 3 hours.
You might get an hour if you're lucky.
Well, what will happen is that you'll be booked into his schedule. His PR lady will be there with him. So she will be controlling all the things he says. I would go and I would say to the victim, you've got to give me 3 hours, I'll give you a good lunch, but you must give me that time. And I can think of 2 exceptions, but with those 2 exceptions, everybody gave me the 3 hours.
Wow.
And because of that, you would often spend the first half hour or 40 minutes although I knew most of them already quite well, it would probably take the first half hour or so to kind of break down all the barriers and get the whole thing to be relaxed.
And just get
and then the good stories would come up. Now, I was lucky because a lot of the people I was interviewing were talking about their past career rather than today. So they were able to, I flew to New Zealand to have lunch with Chris Amon. And Chris Amon was able to tell me stories about driving for Ferrari, which he hadn't really told before because he was sort of worried he'd upset people. He was no longer concerned about upsetting people. The 2 people who didn't need the 3 hours, one was John Watson.
Really?
If you know John Watson, you'll know he likes to talk.
Well, he was one of the longer chats on here. You can go and see it. It's almost 4 hours. It's wonderful.
He probably gave me 7 hours, and I was actually in the car park in the dark saying, "John, I must go." And John was saying, "Yeah, and there's another thing." Bless him. So that was John. The other one that was different was Ron Dennis. I wanted to do an interview with Ron Dennis, and Ron Dennis, as we all know, is not an easy man. But Matt Bishop, who was then the PR man for Ron at McLaren, but had been my editor when I was publishing F1 Racing, very good journalist. I said to Matt, "Look, you've got to say to Ron, can he please have lunch with me for 3 hours? I must have him for 3 hours." And Matt said, "Well, I'll see what I can do."
Finally, this is Matt Bishop, isn't it? From
Matt Bishop, yeah.
Yes, Matt came on last year. He said he might tune in this evening, so if you do,
right. Okay, hello
Matt.
Great man and brilliant journalist.
He is. He's lovely.
Anyway, Matt said, "Look, we finally got Ron lined up. Come to the McLaren Technology Centre at 12:30 on Thursday, and Ron, come to the director's dining room, and Ron will give you 3 hours." So at 12:29, I was there with my photographer, waiting to talk to Ron. Ron appeared at 1:50 and said, "I'm very sorry, but I'm having a difficult day." And he was there for about 15 minutes, which was just long enough to have to take the photographs, and then he left again. And Matt said, "Look, I'm very sorry, I'm terribly embarrassed about this, but I'm going to have to turn that off." Matt said, "Leave it with me, we'll try and sort something out." And I heard nothing for about 3 months. And then Matt rang me and said, "Can you be at Ron Dennis's house?"
You're a man in demand.
I'll keep that figure on. Ron said, Matt said, "Can you be at Ron's house at 5:30 tonight?" So I was at Ron's house at 5:30. Ron actually appeared at about 6:30. And the first half hour was very sort of stilted and difficult. And then suddenly he said, "Let's go to the pub." So we got into Ron's car, we went to the pub, and we were in the pub eating fish and chips until they kind of threw us out at 11:15. It was absolutely wonderful. And that interview wasn't 6,000 words like they usually were, it was 8,000 words. And he was very honest, he was very funny, he was wonderful. But you always had to catch Ron in the right mood, and he wasn't always in the right mood. You know?
I can imagine that, obviously, with what he was up to with McLaren and everything, that, yeah, he was. I always thought Ron could be a bit short, snappy, or just maybe just cut you off if he didn't want to talk about it.
Well, absolutely.
Really.
And I mean, another hugely clever man, another man that I admire enormously. You think what that man has achieved.
Oh, it's incredible, isn't it?
Having started
Project 4, wasn't it? With the
I mean, he was brought up in a 2 up, 2 down. He started as a mechanic at 15 or 16. He had his own Formula 2 team at 23, and you know, more power to him. I think that the way that his time with McLaren ended was very sad.
Yes.
I mean, we all know the reasons for it and how it happened. But the fact is that Ron built that huge edifice that is McLaren. Yeah. And that's Ron's achievement. And I think, you know, we mustn't forget that.
No,
I mean, so many other people, that lunch with thing was a huge privilege. I mean, I mentioned Chris Amon.
Yes, this was one I wanted to ask about, because there's a link to someone we mentioned earlier, isn't there?
Well, yeah,
McLaren and everything. There's a big link.
The thing about, what I used to do with these lunches. How long have we got? I mean, I'm going to talk till midnight.
As long as you like. I mean, I'm fine.
Yes. Um,
All of the viewing numbers are going up, so this is great. It's
um, Chris Amon, as you probably know, has the unenviable title of being the unluckiest driver in Formula One.
yes,
He was
absolutely.
hugely talented. I mean, he was one of the very quickest of his day.
Yeah.
And yet he never won a race. He was frequently not in the right car, and this was probably because he was such a gentle soul. He was such a nice man in a world where you have to hustle for the best drives and so on. But anyway, when you asked him about was he the unluckiest driver, he would say, "Look, mate, I'm the luckiest driver because most of my mates got killed and I'm still here." He retired to his sheep farm right down pretty near the bottom of the North Island of New Zealand.
Wow.
But I mean, a great man, a great figure, one of the greatest drivers ever from that period of Formula One. And I got in touch with him and I said, "Look, I'd like to come to see you and give you lunch and talk to you about your career." And I think I phoned him, that's right. He said, "Yeah," he said, "that sounds great fun, let's do that." And I said, "Well, I'll come to you." He said, No. I live right in the back of the yard." He said, "I'll come to you." I'll come. And he came to Auckland, which is where I'd just flown into the previous evening. He drove 6 hours from his sheep farm in Auckland. And I'd said, "Where do you want to meet for lunch?" And he gave me the address, and I turned up at this address. And it was a rather plain, scruffy little cafe with kind of plastic tables and nothing very special about it at all. It was in one half of a slightly shabby building on the edge of Auckland. The place next door looked like a kind of disused petrol station. Anyway, we had lunch. He was wonderful. He told me these amazing stories. He told the truth about all sorts of things, which I don't think he'd really talked about before, about his time at Ferrari. He said Max Mosley still owed him money because he promised him money which he never paid. All that sort of lovely. And then at the end of the meal, he said we had a fairly kind of indifferent sort of spam fritters type meal. And he said, "Do you know why I asked you to meet me at this restaurant?" And I said, "Well, actually, Chris, I was wondering." He said, "Well, come outside." We went outside and we walked to the other half this sort of semi-detached building. We went to the bit next door. And as I say, it was like a disused bedroom, and there was a little room upstairs. And he pointed to that window and he said, "That was where Bruce McLaren was born."
Wow.
So that was a lovely little bit.
Wow. I mean, given, I guess you would have, you take these people anywhere for lunch, wherever they would like to go.
Yeah,
And
well,
it's
I
just
mean,
lovely.
Emanuele Pirro, I went to see him in
Oh,
this lovely man.
I actually did 2 weeks ago a little 5th birthday thing for the page and invited some past guests on. And Emanuele was in the back end of Germany somewhere. He'd been doing some testing on something, and he was at like a dinner function thing, and he took 10 minutes out of his scheduled paid work to go off and sit at the side and put his phone on, and he joined in for a chat for 10 minutes.
Absolutely. Well, I mean,
that's just Emanuele all over, isn't it?
Him, a lovely house with his lovely wife. And he said, no, we don't go to a restaurant. I will cook lunch. So he cooked this amazing lunch in his kitchen with kind of pasta flying everywhere. He was just delightful. Jochen Mass, who lives in the most beautiful house in the south of France, we sat outside his house. He has this sort of patio with grapes growing over it.
Oh, lovely.
And his beautiful wife made us dinner while we sat outside looking at this beautiful French countryside. Hans Stuck has got an extraordinary house, which is a modern house, which is built, it's up in the mountains.
Yes.
And it's built around this enormous tree. This huge tree kind of goes through the middle of the house. I had lunch with John Force, who is probably the greatest drag racer of modern years.
Is he the father of?
He's father of 3 daughters.
Is it Courtney?
Yeah, he was hilarious. And then another one. I mean, there's so many stories about my lunches. I suddenly realised that nobody had heard anything of Walter Wolf for years.
Yes.
Now, Walter Wolf ran a Formula One team briefly, and Jody Scheckter drove for him and scored a victory for him.
He got involved with Frank Williams, didn't he, and all that?
Yeah, that's right. But he had a lot of money. He was an Austrian. He kind of suddenly appeared. Nobody quite knew where all the money came from. So there's always something sort of slightly shadowy about him. But he was a delightful, very charming man. And I was told that he was living in a huge ranch in northern Canada, snowed in for a lot of the year. Apparently somebody who'd been to see him said he has a notice on the front gate which says, "Never mind the dog, beware of the owner." And I thought, well, I'd love to go to his ranch, but I got in touch with him. He said, no, don't come up here. He said, I have to go to Vancouver on business, so I will see you at the restaurant in Vancouver. So I met him in this restaurant in Vancouver. He was then, I think, 80. He turned up with the most amazing looking girl with legs up to here. She was probably about 23. He introduced her to me as his wife. Whether that was the case or not, I don't know. But we had a hilarious lunch, and he talked all about his motor racing in an extremely kind of frank and honest way. And then towards the end of the lunch, I said, also, you know, you've still got lots of friends in Formula One. People would love to see you. You should come to some races. Why do you stay in Canada all the time? Come over to Europe and see. He said, no. He said, I don't leave Canada because I can't come to Europe. Interpol still have a warrant out for my arrest.
So wherever the money came from, it could have been related to...
If you don't mind me, I mean, do stop me when I'm getting boring. But
no, absolutely not.
A bit about the lunch with stories. A man that I've hugely admired pretty much all my life is Roger Penske.
I've always said he is the one guy I'd love to have on here. He
is remarkable. He's 84 or something.
He's mid-80s, isn't he? Yeah.
He's mid-80s. He is still jetting all over the world, buying companies. I think he now employs around the world 45,000 people.
Goodness me.
And I decided I've got to talk to Roger Penske. And I got in touch I had an introduction, fortunately, to a very nice man who you never hear about. But he was Roger's partner when Roger started his first business. And he's still with him. He's called Walt. Okay. And I had an introduction to Walt. I said, Walt, I would really love to talk to Roger Penske. And he said, well, I'll see what I can do. And then he rang me back and he said, look, Roger's just bought Maranello Concessionaires, the British Ferrari importer. He just bought it last Tuesday. And he wants to come and have a look at what he's bought. So he said he has 6 private jets, but only one of them is transatlantic capable. So he said he's flying in. There's a little aerodrome at Fair Oaks, which is not far from Egham, where Maranello Concessionaires is. He said he's flying in at 6 in the morning. And he says he's too busy to talk to you, but he'll have a cup of coffee with you. Well, I thought a cup of coffee with Roger Penske is better than nothing.
Absolutely.
So 6:30 there I was at Maranello Concessionaires, and he arrived looking absolutely immaculate, whizzed in very energetically, and I introduced myself, and he said, well, I can't talk to you. I want to go and look at the parts department, which is 6 miles down the road, so you better come in the car with me. So I sat in the back of the chauffeur-driven car, started talking to him there. We then got to the parts department, and Roger was shitting up ladders and saying, "You don't seem to have enough oil filters here. You've got to do something about that." And really gets involved in every detail.
Wow.
And anyway, to cut a long story short, during a very hectic day, I managed to spend enough time with Roger to talk about, and to talk a lot about his racing. I mean, particularly how he runs his racing teams. And I also talked to him about his own racing career, because in the early 60s, he was a very good driver himself.
Because he did like Pikes Peak and everything, didn't he? He did all that.
Absolutely. And he's not interested in, he said, I'm not interested in history. I'm always looking at the next deal, at the next company I'm buying. But I did force him to kind of talk about the early days. He said, "You seem to know more about this stuff than I do. I've forgotten about all that stuff." And then Frank Gardner, wonderful man, who would always call a spade a shovel. I mean, he didn't take any prisoners.
Yeah.
In fact, he said, when I said I wanted to go and interview him, I went to Australia to interview him, and he said, "I don't like looking back." He said, "If you look over your shoulder, all you get is a crick in the neck." But he did, in the end, talk to me. And you'll have to forgive the language a little bit here, but...
Oh, no, go for it. It's fine.
Frank was not a man to pay you a compliment.
Right.
You know, he was a pretty rough, tough diver. But he actually said, after I'd done the interview and published it, he liked it. And he got in touch with me, and he said, "Now listen," he said, because he found it difficult to pay a compliment. He said, "I'm not just pissing in your pocket to make your leg feel warm, but that wasn't a bad article."
Oh, I love that. That's lovely. I think I might have to use that phrase. That's I quite like that.
It was full of things like that. Another man who was just so unassuming and so nice, a man who's always been a great, great hero of mine, Jackie Ickx. I mean, not only a brilliant driver in the wet. Think of that French Grand Prix, his first season with Ferrari, French Grand Prix, pouring with rain, he beat everybody.
Was that Rouen?
Rouen? It was absolutely right. It was Rouen. And then all those sports car victories. Amazing man. And I'm pretty much in awe of Jackie Ickx. I got in touch with him and I said, "Look, sorry to bother you, but I'm sure you're terribly busy, but if you happen to be in Brussels at any stage, if I could possibly come to your house and maybe take you to a restaurant, talk to you." He said, "No problem, no problem." And then he texted me again and said, "How are you getting here?" And I said, "Well, I'll come on the Eurostar to Brussels, very easy. And my Eurostar gets in at about 11:45, so if it's all right, I'll come to your house about 12. So he said, okay. When our train pulled in to the station at Brussels, me and the photographer, he'd actually come to the station, was standing on the platform, he'd come to the station to meet us. And wow. This was a great 5-time Le Mans winner, great 6-time Le Mans winner, I think.
I think it's 6, and he's one of the Nürburgring.
I mean, that is how. Can you imagine that happening with one of today's Formula One drivers?
Absolutely no chance. I mean, I actually had Jackie on here a couple of years ago, just for an hour. He's incredibly busy, and it was lovely off camera. He said, "Oh, you must be the famous Rich." I went, "There's only one of us is famous here, Jackie. Come on."
He's a lovely man. Yeah.
But I have to show everyone this. This is one of the highlights of my year.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah,
that was a Goodwood this year. That photo has been saved to about 15 different places, so I don't ever lose it. Because Jackie is, he's absolutely wonderful. And one of the, I guess underrated. Maybe people talk about the best drivers there's ever been. People rightly talk about Jimmy and Jackie Stewart and Mario, and all the other drivers for but like Jackie never seems to get mentioned in F1 terms as much as he should.
Yeah, but you see, that leads us to something which I feel pretty passionate about. I mean, I worked in Formula One for 25 years. Formula One is the pinnacle. It is the most competitive part of motor racing. Technologically, it is the cleverest. It's certainly the wealthiest. It certainly has the biggest audience. But it's not all about Formula One. I mean, I met somebody the other day who said, "Oh, you're something to do with motor racing. I love motor racing. It's my favourite sport. I never miss a race." I said, "Really? Well, that's pretty impressive."
Cool. You must spend a lot of time in front of the telly.
Well, I know. I said, "You never miss a race." I was thinking, when did you last go to Silverstone or Goodwood or Castle Coolidge? He said, "Oh, I've never been to a motor race, but I watch every race." And he had no concept that there was anything that was motor racing outside Formula One. He thought Formula One was motor racing, and that was it.
It drives me
I
back.
believe that you don't know what motor racing is unless you've stood on the bank at Snetterton in the rain and watched a saloon race. Motor racing is at all levels. I mean, the level that I take part in motor racing, it's about the lowest level you could have. I love doing hill climbs in my 74-year-old mad sports racing car.
Yes.
I get huge fun out of that. Well, people don't know what hill climbing is. They think it involves going up a muddy hill in a sort of trial special. And I think it's important to remember that Le Mans, Indy,
I love Indy.
Rallying, motorsport is a huge, huge business, and it's a shame that Formula One gets 90% of the coverage, 90% of the money. That's a pity, because there's an awful lot of other good stuff going on out there.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of set this little sort of page up. And as I mentioned in the articles, there's 3 a day that I do, and I try and cover everything as best I can because there's so much out there. And I set it up because there was pages just for F1 or just for touring cars or just for NASCAR. I thought, can we have something where it's all together? And that's the thing, as you say, you need to watch touring cars and get wet, or go and watch the Fun Cup, or go and watch a 6-hour, the enduro car thing they have at the moment, these little, or brick car racing or something like you've got to go, you've got to get trackside, you've got to get, someone's just said, you've got to be standing there watching a night race and you've got wet socks. Yeah, you've got to do it.
No, I mean, it's extraordinary to remember, because the television coverage of Formula One, I have to say, technically, it's fantastic.
It's superb.
It's amazingly well done. When I started commentating, I would be in a rickety little box with a small television screen, probably that big, sometimes in black and white. No such thing as a timing screen. I would have a lap charter. Who remembers lap charts? I would have a chum sitting with me with a sheet of paper and a pencil, writing down the numbers, because that's the only way I could work out who was leading the race, what lap we were on. None of it was on the screen.
Yeah.
And the race that really stays in my memory is the Japanese Grand Prix in 1976.
Now, I've always wanted to speak to you about this, because we know.
It was a kind of one of the days of my life that I won't forget. The first thing that you have to understand, which seems so extraordinary now, is that the Japanese Grand Prix in 1976, the last round of the World Championship, a World Championship which was being fought down to the wire between James Hunt, British driver, and Niki Lauda, the man who'd come back from the dead with that awful accident at the Nürburgring. So you couldn't get a bigger deal than that. It wasn't live on television. It was not live on British television. That was partly because the race happened at 5 o'clock in the morning, UK time.
Yes.
And what the television was going to do was have edited highlights on the Sunday afternoon. So the only way that you could find out what was happening live was by listening to the radio.
And
The only way you could find out in
listening
the
to it on
English
the radio.
language what was happening was by listening either to the BBC or to the BBC World Service. And that was me.
Yeah.
So as you remember the story, it poured with rain. Everything was in complete chaos. I was in my little commentary box with my chum, Quentin Spurring, keeping the lap chart. Pouring rain, pit stops, tyre changes, the whole thing became a complete muddle. And he just kept his head down, he was writing his numbers, cars went past him to spray, they were all on different laps, and if you remember the race, Nicky Lauda withdrew after 2 laps, saying he thought the race shouldn't take place. Actually, not a cowardly thing to do, actually quite a brave thing to do, because he said, I'm going to show that I'm going to turn my back on the World Championship because I think this is not the right way to run motor racing. That's really why it stopped. James Hunt, of course, carried on. And what it meant, as Lauda had stopped, James knew he had to finish 3rd in the race to be world champion. But in fact, it poured with rain, he led the race. But as the track dried out, the wet weather tyres, it was a very abrasive track, the wet weather tyres were wearing out, and various people stopped, and McLaren decided to keep James out. And Andretti timed it absolutely right. Andretti in the JPS Lotus won the race, having got onto the right tyres at the right time. James,
I actually spoke to Mario and said, does it annoy you that people forget that you won that race?
right. Well, James wanted to stop. Finally, they did bring him into the pits. It was a disastrous pit stop because I think the car fell off the jack or something. I knew they had to bodily lift the car up to do the tyre change. It was all a terrible muddle. James went shooting back in a rage back into the race. While all this chaos was going on, my lap charter was keeping his lap chart. But at Mount Fuji, which is where the circuit was, they had this tower.
Oh, it's like at Indianapolis, isn't it? It's
exactly, with the numbers, electric numbers on. And as the race ended, Mario Andretti won the race. And on this tower, it had James Hunt, his number, in 5th place, which means, of course, he'd lost the championship. But my lap charter had him in 3rd place. So I had to take a decision. If James was 3rd, according to my lap charter, he was the world champion. If the official scoreboard, which was more likely to be right, if that was right, then he wasn't world champion. I had to take the decision. And I decided to go with my lap charter. And I said to my huge audience in the UK, because they couldn't hear it on TV, they all had to listen to the radio. I had a huge audience out in the rest of the world listening to BBC World Service. I made my decision and I said, and James Hunt is champion of the world. James came into the pits in an absolute rage because, of course, James could see the timing tower. He could see that, according to the timing tower, he was in 5th place. It had all been thrown away by McLaren keeping him out too long and then mucking up his pit stop. And as he came into the pits, he got out of the cockpit in a huge rage. There's a famous photograph taken by a photographer called David Phipps, who was standing in the pit lane behind the car as James was getting out in this rage. You could see by his body language, he's absolutely furious. And Teddy Mayer, who was then the McLaren team boss, is standing in front of him doing that because he's saying, "You're third." And at that moment, the scoreboard changed and we were all right and James was third.
Wow.
So if I got it wrong, that could have been the end of a not particularly great broadcasting career.
It could have, yeah, it could have been, yeah, I think it's what they would call today a fail, but it's absolutely not. I mean, that's one of those races. I mean, unfortunately, I wasn't even born until 5 years later. Unfortunately, it's one of those races that I wish, if there was the ability to teleport back in time or time travel, that's the one I'd love to go to, just because it just looked rotten. The weather looked horrendous. We've all seen the pictures, and was it the one the footage of, was it Jochen Mass going off and stoving in front of the car in, and was it Vittorio Brambilla's spin? And I just wondered what it was like to be there. It's probably a good time, actually. I just want to bring this in. The film Rush. I mean, I'm sure everyone here has seen the film Rush. A lot of people perhaps wouldn't have known about. It's slightly skewed because it makes it look like they hate each other, which I know they didn't. I've spoken with Freddie, and he doesn't rate the film at all. Freddie Hunt. But obviously,
sorry, you're breaking up. Are you still getting me? Because you've frozen. Hello, Rich. We've lost the line, I think. Ah, you're back again.
My apologies, folks. I think we just had a bit of high winds here, and it's just blocked it out. Anyway,
yes, Rush.
As I was saying, Rush. It was filmed. Some of it was filmed out at Blackbush Airport, just down the road here.
Yeah.
I guess you were approached to be a part of it, and what did you think when it was all going to happen? And then
I'll tell you how it happened. I mean, the first thing to say is that I don't know how much you know about Hollywood, how interested you are in movies and so on, but Ron Howard, who directed Rush, is an absolutely remarkable director. And if you look at the big movies he's done, like Apollo 13, he's done Parenthood, he's done so many great movies. And he's a very, very polished director who really knows his onions. And he decided, excuse me, he decided that this would make a great story. And he understood that it would only work if he portrayed Hunt and Lauder as being, if not enemies, not keen on each other. And we all know that that's not quite how it was. I mean, I remember Niki Lauda sleeping on James Hunt's floor when they were doing a Formula 3 race at Crystal Palace. But nevertheless, Niki Lauda was involved in the film, and what Ron decided to do was to put a little scene at the end, you may remember, where they kind of met each other and
in the hangar.
I've seen pretty much all the Hollywood movies about motor racing. Once every 10 years, Hollywood decides to make a big motor racing movie. And a lot of them have been a disaster. The one recently that offended me most was the one about Ford at Le Mans. Was it called Ford versus Ferrari?
I'm very glad you said that, because I watched it and I didn't, because I remember the original Le Mans film with Steve McQueen, which was all very different. And everyone seems to have loved Ford v Ferrari, and controversially, I didn't.
Well, it was. I mean, let's go into it in detail. But I mean, they seemed to think that they had to explain to the great unwashed who were watching the race that Le Mans only has one driver, because the co-drivers never appeared. Among the umpteen historical errors, or ignoring history, the idea of Carroll Shelby and Ken Miles having a fist fight in the street I just find that embarrassing. Now, the thing about Rush is that Ron Howard wasn't a motor racing man, but he took a lot of advice from a lot of people. He involved a lot of people who knew about motor racing. And he really wanted the thing. He thought the story was so good that it could work, without being mucked around with. And he decided that, obviously the film was going to be shown all around the world, and he decided that, and was going to be dubbed into various languages, as happens with big films. So he decided that he would use a commentator's voice in different parts of to explain different bits of the story. So he said to his casting director, "Look, can you go and get me a young Japanese actor to be the Japanese commentator, and go and get me a young Portuguese actor to be the Brazilian commentator, and go and get me a French actor and so on, and go and get me some young, good-looking English actor to be the English commentator." And somebody said to him, "Well, we can do that." The casting director said, "Well, we can get you a sort of young, good-looking English actor." But actually, I think the guy who was the BBC radio commentator at the time may still be alive. We may be able to find him. So then I got a phone call, and I ended up with a trailer with my name on the door, just like a big Hollywood film star. I was actually on set for about 5 days, but it was tremendous fun.
Wow.
And Ron Howard was rather like Bernie Ecclestone. He's a small man. When Bernie comes into a room, everybody kind of stands up straight and goes a bit quiet. And Ron has the same effect. He's a very, very talented guy. And actually, he did also ask me to do, when they were doing the editing of some of the motor racing sequences, he wanted to make sure that the kind of pit stop sequences were right. And he got me to come into the editing suite, sometime after all the shooting had been done, because how they edit a big movie is amazing. They end up with 85 hours of film, and they've got to produce a 2-hour film.
That's
In
incredible.
TV, which I'm used to working in, it's got to be done quickly. It can't be perfect, but it's got to be done by 3:00 this afternoon. In a movie, you can spend all day worrying about one frame because the budget is huge and they've got lots of time. So it's a fascinating process. But I thought, I'm biased, but I thought Rush, for a Hollywood movie about motor racing, was good.
Yeah, there's a comment actually here says that motor racing films are like motor racing novels. The vast majority are, quote, not my words, a bit pants, but you do get some gems in the muck heap, and Rush is one of them. Yes, agreed.
Please, thank you.
Yes, I think I would go along with that. I think Freddie Hunt's issue was that, obviously Daniel Bruhl had the notable advantage of his character still being alive, with Nicky obviously before he passed, whereas James had passed away. But Freddie said that his issue was that Chris Hemsworth made no effort to contact the Hunt family and didn't have any research or anything like that. And again, pardon the language, I remember Freddie saying he portrayed my father as a bit of an asshole. And I think that was Freddie's issue. I think it's more of a personal thing with him.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting because Daniel Bruhl, who I think was a brilliant Nicky Lauda.
It was superb, wasn't it? I think he had the look, which helped.
Well, yeah, he did. But an actor getting a look is a lot with what the actor is doing with his face and his mouth and so on. And Daniel Bruhl, who's a very talented German actor, very successful now, and he's had a lot of success since Rush. But he knew nothing about racing, he knew nothing about Nicky Lauda. So he got in touch with Nicky Lauda and he said, "Look, I'm about to play you in a film, and I wonder if I could come and spend some time with you so that I can see, what you like and so on." Well, now Nicky Lauda, he's no respecter of persons. Nicky will tell you what he thinks of you.
Yeah.
And I'll leave out the four-letter word. Speaking rather like four-letter word, but bless him, he's not with us anymore, sadly. But Nicky said to Daniel Brühl, okay, you can come, but don't bring a suitcase because I'll throw you out after 10 hours. So Daniel said, okay, and he flew to Portugal where Nicky was living there, and turned up. And Nicky so liked him that he actually stayed with Nicky for a fortnight. He kind of won Nicky over. And
if you can impress Nicky Lauda, you're doing well.
Well, exactly, and that's why I think he was. He got him so well in the film. I thought he did a wonderful job.
Yeah, I thought he was very, very good as well. I must just to close out on Rush. I just love the closing line. I think it brought a few. I think it brought a few little tears to a lot of people when he just said, "What was it? Last time I saw James, he was on a bike with no shoes and he had a flat tire, living life, living each day as if it was his last, just like he always did. He was few that I respected and even fewer that I liked. He remains the only man I envy." And I just thought that was just the most beautiful way to end the film.
Yeah,
because Nicky Lauda was known as being quite hard nosed.
That came from the scriptwriter, and how much from Nicky, I don't know, but it was a good line.
But I mean, it was a lovely line. Yeah, and one I personally enjoyed. Just a very quick look here. Oh, actually, Oliver Taylor. Yes, he said that Ford v Ferrari was so wrong on so many levels, and treated the viewers as unintelligent. I won't use the word, which I think is right.
Which film is he referring to?
That was Ford versus Ferrari. Just to step back, yeah.
I think we agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It didn't quite work out. I did want to find something here from. I want to say hello to Indira Flack, who is a photographer. She does. She's done the Great British Racing Drivers book. Hello, Indira. She is lovely, and I have completely forgotten where her comment was. Sorry, Indira. If you want to type it again, please do. But it was just basically saying that that your lunch with episodes were a great source of research for her when she was doing her book.
Well, Indira would be. I mean, she's a wonderful portrait photographer.
She is amazing.
One of the things that was vital with my lunch with articles, I had a very good portrait photographer who came to all the British and European ones. He didn't come to America or New Zealand. We had to find other photographers for that. But persuading a magazine to give an article enough space to have a whole page portrait. It was very important in all of those interviews to have a whole page portrait. And as she will know, because she produced that lovely book, a portrait that is well taken somehow catches the person's character as well as just what their face looks like. It's very important for an interview. And I love her book. I think it's a tremendous success, and I hope she's going to do another one.
Yeah, I mean, it is superb. One, I'm just going to blow a bit of smoke here for Indira. Hello, Indira. She is in. She's watching. There was one of the photos. I think it was of the very sadly now late Paddy Hopkirk, and it was just a lovely photo of him. And I don't know what it was about him, but it was almost one of those where his eyes followed you. It was one of those lovely. It was like he was looking out the page, looking sort of straight.
Are you saying that was in her book, or was it in my interview?
I think that was in her book.
Yeah.
I think, and it was wonderful. Oh, she just said that she got locked in his toilet.
Fine.
I think we'll stop there with the details, but that's that's amazing. But yeah, it's a fabulous book, folks. It's GBRD, the Great British Racing Drivers book. Absolutely fantastic portrait book. Go and check it out. Yes,
you mentioned Paddy Hopkirk, who was a lovely man. Of course, I had to have a lunch with him, but I've known him for years because he was. I mean, not only was he a great rally driver, but he was also a lovely man to be with. I mean, he loved a party, and he always, wherever you went, Paddy always seemed to be there. And coincidentally, this very afternoon, I was doing some research for a piece of work I'm doing. And I discovered, which I'd never known, that Paddy Hopkirk was dyslexic. Now, we all know Jackie Stewart was dyslexic, and we all know that a lot of the extraordinary motivation and also the kind of organisation and tidiness that comes with Jackie Stewart. A lot of the early effort that Paddy Hopkirk made, becoming a very successful rally driver in Ireland very young, was because he was hopeless at school and everybody thought he was stupid, which was exactly what happened with Jackie. The point about Jackie is that in 1940s Scotland, in his little village school, nobody had heard of dyslexia. And Jackie only found out about dyslexia when his son, one of his two sons, Mark, was having trouble at school. They were in Switzerland, and they went to a doctor, and the doctor said, well, I mean, it's quite clear, your son is dyslexic. And Jackie said, well, what's dyslexic? And that was really how Jackie became, started to understand where he came from.
I didn't realise that.
Too, which I didn't know until this very day.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, because obviously we've seen the documentary on Jackie. It's absolutely wonderful documentary, and it goes into that in some detail, doesn't it? About how he used to struggle, how he used to tell people that he used to read books on planes about things, and it was all keeping up a front almost.
Exactly.
Which is wonderful. Just very quickly, obviously we know Jackie Stewart is the founder of the Race Against Dementia charity. We're actually running a fundraiser for that. So head over to the page, guys. We've got a huge list of prizes, over 150 prizes, from signed race gloves and race boots from Andy Prio and John Cleland to trophies and photos and all that kind of thing. So head over to the page and make a donation. Every £1 you donate will get you an entry into the draw. Let's raise loads of money for Race Against Dementia. Anyway, that's that plugged. Very quickly, I did see a comment earlier on about, do you remember the racing driver, Earl Howe? I believe he was France. Is that Francis Curzon or something?
It was the Curzon family.
Yes.
He was the Earl.
Yes.
Amazing character.
Yeah.
Very good driver. He was Francis Curzon, but he became Earl Howe when his dad died in the 1920s. Lots of money, lots of style. Always wore a slouch cap on the side of his head. Always had a red carnation in his buttonhole.
Wow.
Except when he was racing. The cars that he owned and he raced, because he had lots and lots of money, Bugatti, Maserati, Delage, Alfa Romeo. He won Le Mans with Tim Birkin, won Le Mans in 1931 or so. He was a great character. He was never going to give up racing, I think, but he was 56 and still racing when World War II broke out. And then after the war was over, he decided he'd better be sensible and stop racing. So he then became a kind of major character in motor race organisation. He was the president of the BRDC. He was on the RAC competitions committee and all that sort of thing. But despite his title and his money, he was actually a pretty good driver as well.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. I don't know how I knew the name Francis Curzon, but anyway, no, that was lovely. And thank you. I think it's David Allen who put the comment in. Thank you very much for that. Just another one that's come in from a guy tuning in on YouTube called Rallycross Craig. Hello, Craig. He says, great show. Thank you. Could you ask Simon to share his memories of Neville Hay, who was a great commentator and a real gentleman who sadly passed earlier this year? Craig filmed with him at the Will Hire 24-hour races.
Yeah. Neville was a wonderful enthusiast. He commentated as a circuit commentator, which is how a lot of commentators start. I think in the 50s he was commentating at Silverstone. Enormously enthusiastic, very good memory, and a great man for an anecdote. And because he'd been around racing for so long, if you found yourself propping up a bar with Neville, he would always come up with, you could just drop a name and he would say, yes, well, I shared a hotel room with him in 1962 or whatever it might be. He was a lovely character. He was a very good commentator. And his son moved in the same circles, in that he then started a very successful television production company, which is still booming away. But Neville was a lovely man, and it was very sad that he left us. But he had a jolly good life, and I don't think he stopped talking for about 70 years.
Fabulous. The way it should be within motorsport. You need to tell these stories. That's wonderful. Another quick one that's just come in. Going back to the lunch series, was AJ Foyt's cheeseburger as good as Mario Andretti's?
That is such a good story. Well, thank you very much.
AJ Foyt as well. What a guy! Wow.
Remembers that story. I mean, I obviously don't need to tell the story to him because he knows it. But if you don't, or if everybody else doesn't, I suppose I better tell you.
Oh, that would be lovely.
When I went to see Mario Andretti, I went to Nazareth, Pennsylvania, which is fascinating because when Mario's dad and his 14-year-old twins, Mario and Aldo, and other children, immigrated from Italy to America, they arrived pretty penniless off the boat, wherever it was you did in New Jersey. And they thought they'd better kind of move across to see whether they could get work somewhere. And they left the sort of rough areas where they'd been dumped, and they moved. I think they probably had some dream of getting to California and the
going the whole way.
But they got as far as Nazareth, Pennsylvania, which is a pretty small town. And for some reason, they stopped there. And
I think there was a racetrack there, wasn't there? That might have had something to do with it.
Yes, or there might have been men, but I think anyway, at that point, Mario's dad decided that perhaps he could get a job in Nazareth. So he stayed there. The point about this is that Mario, having become one of the most successful and one of the most versatile American racing drivers of all time, and having who knows how many squillions of dollars in the bank, and being a highly sophisticated and authoritative man, what's so great about him is that he stayed in Nazareth. It's a little bit like, I don't know, being born in Shepton Mallet and going off and becoming internationally famous and hugely rich and staying in Shepton Mallet. And I think that's wonderful. And
his house is lovely.
His house is amazing.
It's I guess for this fundraiser that I mentioned, and I still can't believe that I'm quite pally with Mario and his PA lady Patty. And I sent some photos to Mario, which he's very kindly sent back as prizes for this fundraiser. And he's got this lovely little gold sticker that he puts on the envelope with his address on it. And I had a quick Google search, and it's a lovely house.
It is an amazing house, and as I remember it, it has the sort of garages in the bottom.
Yeah.
And I went and met him there. We were off to lunch, and he said, "What should we go? Let's go in the Lamborghini." So we got into his Countach, and we drove about a quarter of a mile to. And there isn't much in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. It's still a very small town. You're not going to get a grand restaurant there. So we went to a very nice hamburger joint, but there was on the table a bottle of wine, which came from Mario's Napa Valley, California vineyard, because he has a vineyard in California. And we had a very nice meal, and it was a nice place. Well, about a year, maybe 2 years later, I managed to persuade. I mean, you talk about Patty, Mario's PA. AJ Foyt has a wonderful PA whose job is to sort of keep people away from AJ. Everybody wants to go and see AJ, and AJ doesn't want to see anybody.
And no one's going to argue either.
Yeah. And I managed somehow to persuade her that, oh no, I'll tell you how it happened. I'm having a senior moment. Who was the Scandinavian guy who raced for, he was mainly a European racer, but he raced for Foyt's team for a while. And I'm ashamed, I did a lunch with him, and I'm ashamed to say his name's so scroll, but anyway, I was sitting with him and he was telling me about driving for Foyt. And I said,
Kenny Brack? No, it wasn't Kenny Brack, was it? No.
No.
I can't think. Scandinavia. What kind
I'll
of?
come back to you on that one. But anyway, the point is that I said, gosh, AJ Foyt, what's he really like? I'd love to go and do a lunch with him. And he said, well, I've got his number on my phone. I'll dial him. So as we sat at the restaurant, he dialed AJ Foyt in Houston, Texas. And I heard him. I could hear this call, and he said, well, there's this chap, Simon Taylor, and he's a journalist from England, and he does these interviews and blah, 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 and he'd like to come and see you. And I could hear AJ's gravelly voice coming over the phone. He said, is this Limey a good guy? And he said, yeah, he's a good guy. Oh, you better tell him to come. So I went, and I got to Houston, and you leave Houston, and you drive away from Houston, and you're in the middle of this kind of empty, flat plain of Texas. Have you seen a movie called North by Northwest?
Yes, with the plane and yeah.
Right. Well, do you remember when he's waiting for the bus and there's this flat nothingness? No cars, just a straight road. Well, AJ Foyt, I went along this road and I was told, you keep going. I said, my little high car, you keep going, and eventually you'll see a left turn. And there was nothing, no house, just flat emptiness. And there was this little road going off, and the road was called Foyt Avenue. So I turned down and drove on for about 3 miles, and there was Foyt's facility, which is all very smart and so on, but it's miles from anywhere. And AJ was very nice, and we talked for a bit, and then he said, well, we better go and have lunch. He said, only place we could go to is there's a Mexican just up the lane. He's got a hamburger joint. So I said, fine. He said, you all right with a hamburger? And foolishly, forgetting that in their racing days, there was no love lost between AJ and Mario.
Yes.
I said to him, oh, hamburger's fine, AJ. In fact, when I went to see Mario Andretti, I had a hamburger. And at the mention of Mario Andretti, the temperature in the room went down about 5 degrees.
Oh.
Anyway, I realised my boo, but we went to this filthy little place. There was a Mexican little shack with some pretty disgusting sort of bits of meat hanging up. So he hacked off some meat and gave us a bit of bread, and he gave us these huge hamburgers. And I mean, I'm actually nearly vegetarian, but I kind of did my best. I gritted my teeth and I started to plow through this great wodge of greasy meat. And AJ, putting away his, he said, how's your hamburger? I said, oh, AJ, it's really lovely. Thank you very much. It's great. Is it better than Andretti's? But that's a story that obviously one of your listeners knows.
That's brilliant. It's like, forget the rest. Have I beaten Mario? It's the, yeah. That's superb. And AJ, and he's still going strong, which is good to see.
Absolutely.
Still good. Yeah, that's fantastic. I actually spoke with one of his drivers, is it Dalton Kellett, a couple of years ago, and he just said that he portrays this sort of gruff, outwardly kind of gruff and kind of guy, but he said if he likes you, he's a big cuddly teddy bear. And I thought, I don't think AJ could ever be a big cuddly teddy bear. But
obviously, actually, another wonderful American guy who was a huge hero of mine. I wanted to make sure in my lunches that we covered NASCAR.
Yes.
So Richard Petty had to be Richard Petty.
Oh, what? Wow.
And
oh, wow. I sat in his car at Goodwood this year, the 43, the Plymouth.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
Oh,
Well, we
almost
went to
cried.
this place, and there was a kind of museum full of various 43s. There's no sign of Petty, but I think there was a sort of PA who said, "Look, Richard will be along in a minute," and then the door, sort of at the other end, opened, and this tall figure in cowboy boots, Stetson hat,
The
and
shades.
dark glasses came in, sort of looked down at me, and he was chewing tobacco. He looked down at me and said, "Howdy," and spat the tobacco. There was a sort of spittoon which was available at different points around. I mean, that's real old Deep South stuff. But he
Proper.
was delightful. And the really sad thing, of course, his grandson
Yes.
killed.
Yes, because of
He
his
has
son.
a sort of in where he is. He has a sort of mini Disney World, a little children's playground, which is in his grandson's memory. So kids can go along and play there and look at cars and sit in cars and so on. But when we were about the photographer was about to take the portrait, and of course he was still wearing these dark glasses, and so the portrait photographer, we had a very good American portrait photographer coming on, and he said to Petty, we want to take this portrait now, Mr. Petty. Would you just like to take your sunglasses off? No, he wouldn't take them off. So we had to have the picture with him with his dark glasses on.
Absolute veto. Wow.
Great character.
Wow. Yeah, he's again one of those guys, the legendary guys I'd love to speak with. So Keith Moe said, was this Scandinavian driver Kenny Brack, which is who I thought it might have been, or Frederick Ekblom? Yeah, they're
No, I think it was Kenny Brack. I think it must have been Kenny Brack. That's right.
Yeah.
I think it was. Yeah.
I'm actually in contact with Kenny. I want to speak to him because he obviously survived the unsurvivable, that huge crash he had.
Hold on, did Jan Lammers ever drive Indy? No, because I'm muddling it up because I went to Holland to speak to Jan Lammers. He's a lovely chap.
Yes, and again, all of these chaps you mentioned, they're always chaps I'd love to get hold of to have a chat with them. Anyway, wonderful people. Just another couple of people there that I'd like to get your sort of thoughts on. Obviously, we've mentioned like Jackie and Sterling and everyone. One person who he raced before my time, and someone who I've always been kind of fascinated by. And I think it was on one of your commentaries from way back, was Jean-Pierre Beltoise, because he had an accident, didn't he? He broke his arm, and he didn't have much mobility in one of his arms, from what I can gather. And he was enormously underrated. He only did like 70 on Grand Prix, but he was enormously underrated, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a delightful chap. He was a motorcycle racer and had a horrible motorcycle accident which damaged his arm very much. So he didn't have much movement of his arm. Funnily enough, I first met him because he was staying with a friend of mine. This was in the 60s. He'd just come into Formula 3. And he was staying with a Formula 3 racer friend of mine who said, "You've got to meet the French guy because he's going to be great." And so I think I wrote a piece about him for Autosport in probably 1967 or something. And he was certainly underrated. Lovely chap, very self-effacing, quiet, just a nice guy.
Yeah.
I mean, the other Frenchman that I really regret his passing because his death was so terrible was Francois Cevert.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
As you know, that US Grand Prix, 1973, was going to be Jackie Stewart's last race. It would have been his 100th Grand Prix.
Yes.
With a nice number. And Francois Cevert was going to step into his shoes as the number one at Tyrrell. And I think he would have done very well. he was a delightful chap. He's a very good pianist. If you were kind of in a restaurant with him and there was a piano in the corner, he'd sort of go off and start playing classical music. Absolutely beautiful. Real character.
That's lovely. I mean, that's a real what if story, isn't it? I mean, because we all know how highly Jackie Stewart rated him. Just very quickly, we mentioned Matt Bishop earlier on. I know he's particularly fond of Francois Sever's blue eyes, and who wouldn't be? I mean, my goodness.
Well,
no matter who you are, you can't help but just stare.
Francois Sever had a sister, I think I've got this right, who I think was, if you imagine Francois Sever's eyes in the face of a beautiful blonde girl, then you can see what we're talking about. I hope I'm not putting my foot in my mouth here, but I think, I'll have to look it up when the programme's finished, I seem to remember that Francois Sever's sister married Jean-Pierre Beltoise. I may have got that horribly wrong, but I think that was the case. I certainly remember Sever's sister looking extremely beautiful.
Wow, okay. I didn't realise that. I'll have to have a quick look into that. That's a nice little crossover.
Don't blame me if I'm wrong, but there's just a little kind of memory tickling away in the back of my brain.
Yeah, that's wonderful. There is one other person we have to speak about. One thing I did want to talk about was like Jochen Rindt. We all know what happened. Oh, so someone has just said yes with a thumbs up. So that sounds like Beltoise did indeed marry.
Okay.
Yes, true, correct. Thank you. That's our friend Nikki over at the Nürburgring. Good stuff. Obviously, we said about Jochen Rindt, and we all know what happened with him at Monza. And I spoke with Frank Durney about this, and with David Tremaine, who also said he may tune in. If you are tuning in, David, hello. With the mechanical failure and everything, with what happened at the braking at Monza, there was a lovely story that I read somewhere about. Was it before March Engineering was set up? Jochen Rindt gave it another name because it was all going together in a little shed or something. I remember hearing something about this.
What happened was that Jochen and Colin Chapman, this is Bernard early 69, Chapman and Jochen were not getting on. Jochen believed that Chapman's cars were dangerous and too fragile. It all came to a head. I mean, funnily enough, I knew Jochen extremely well, and the reason why I knew him well was because in those days, Formula One drivers also did Formula 2. And the way the calendar worked was that you had a Formula One race, and then on the next weekend, you'd have a Formula 2 race, and then another Formula One race. And all the Formula One drivers did Formula 2, but they loved doing it because it was terribly relaxed. The races weren't that important. And in those days, Gregor Grant was editing Autosport, we're talking 67. And he would go to all the Grand Prix, but he didn't want to be bothered with Formula 2. So I would go to the Formula 2 races, and the Formula 1 drivers would be very relaxed. And Jochen loved Formula 2, won a lot of Formula 2 races. I got to know him pretty well. And I remember him talking to me immediately after the Grand Prix of the British Grand Prix in 1969 at Silverstone. There was a fantastic battle between Jackie Stewart in the Matra and Jochen in the Lotus 49. Terrific battle, lead changing and changing. And Chapman always wanted to keep the weight as low as possible, and he would always calculate how much fuel it was allowed to have. Didn't want any more fuel than he thought was just what was needed to do the race. He wanted his cars to run out of fuel on the slowing down there. Wow. And he didn't quite get the he didn't quite do the sum right, and the car started to run out at the end of the race. And Jochen was absolutely furious. And in those days, there weren't sort of press conferences and things like that. And there weren't motorhomes. The drivers would change their overalls in the back of the truck. And I was standing by the Lotus truck when Jochen came storming out of the pits, having just got out of the car to go into the back of the truck and get changed. I just happened to be the first person that he bumped into when he was absolutely raging, and all this came pouring out about what he thought about Colin Chapman and what an arse he was now he lost in the race and so on. So things were not going well. At that point, Max Mosley was putting together his plan to rule the world, rule Formula One. And of course, he wanted to involve Jochen Rindt, who was then the fastest driver around. And there was a man called Graham Coker, who was a fabricator and a kind of a mechanic, really. And he had a shed in which he was building for Max Mosley the first ever March, the March 693, which was the car that Ronnie Peterson debuted at Cadwell Park in September 69. And Max said, look, we're going to make this wonderful new Formula One team, and you can come and be the lead driver. We're going to win everything. It's all going to be wonderful. And Jochen sort of had a look at all of this and worked out what was going on. He said, yeah, you've still got, you haven't got proper workshop. You just got, meaning Graham's shed. He said, you just got Glen Sheck. Glen Sheck. And Max loved this. And so when March was first launched, they were keeping it all a bit quiet, and they needed to have a sort of shadow company. It was called Glen Sheck Engineering. So that's the story of that. But Jochen was just such a tragedy, because he was constantly worried about Lotus fragility, and he wanted to leave Lotus, and Chapman persuaded him to stay by showing him the drawings of the Lotus 72. Said, this is going to be the most amazing car, which it was. This is going to beat everybody, which it did. Jochen, as you know, what actually happened, I think this is generally agreed, the car had inboard front disc brakes.
Yes.
And the brakes were connected to the wheels by shafts, so that you have the wheel, then you have the shaft, and then you have the disc brake with the driver's feet between them. And Colin Chapman, always neurotic about weight, every part of the car had to be looked at to see if they could shave another ounce off it. And those brake shafts were hollow, because Chapman said, they will be strong enough, they can be hollow, you don't want to have any extra weight. And a brake shaft had already broken on John Miles, I think at the Austrian Grand Prix. I think I got that right.
Okay.
Your very knowledgeable chap at the Nürburgring, or one of your listeners, will be able to cover. I think John Miles had a problem the previous race, which may be in Austria. Anyway, what happened was that the the right-hand brake shaft broke, which meant that the left-hand brake was on, so the car turned sharp left into the barriers.
Right. Yeah.
And the other thing was that Jochen hated crutch straps. By then, they were wearing proper harnesses which had shoulders, lap strap, and crutch straps. But he never did the crutch straps up. He just hated them. And so when the car hit the barrier, he tunneled down into the monocoque, and it broke his neck. And it was just terrible, because I was very fond of Jochen. I wasn't at the Italian Grand Prix that year. I don't know why. I was at home in London. And I remember getting a phone call from Italy. It was about 3:00 in the afternoon, it was Saturday afternoon. And once again, I had to write a bloody obituary, It was just terrible. And, one got to know these people. Someone knew, some of them you knew slightly, some of them you knew well. And when they were killed, it was just like a friend being killed. I had a lovely time with Piers Courage. We went to it was the first race at Jarama. They'd only just finished the Jarama circuit near Madrid. And the first time it was running was a Formula 2 race. And I went down there, as usual, on my non-existent Autosport expenses. So I went down and I had one scruffy pair of trousers and one T-shirt. And I was staying in a flop house somewhere in the back streets of Madrid. And after Saturday practice, I was talking to Piers, and we were having a terrific discussion. I can't remember what. And we were both deep in discussion. And Piers said, God, I've got to get back to the hotel. Look, come back to the hotel and we can have some supper and we'll carry on talking. Well, Piers, of course, was staying at the Madrid Hilton, which in those days was the best hotel in Madrid, just about. And so we turned up at the Madrid Hilton. Piers swept in, with me rather kind of shyly following behind him. And as we went into the dining room, the maitre d'hotel sort of slipped in between Piers and me and stood in front of me and said, I am very sorry, senor, but you cannot come in. And Piers turned around and said, well, what's the problem? What's the problem? I'm afraid, senor, your guest is not wearing a tie. Well, I mean, not only is I not wearing a tie, I wasn't actually wearing a shirt. I was just having a sort of, I just had a T-shirt on. And Piers said, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. He's my friend. I want to have him. And I'm sorry, sir, it is the rule. He cannot come in without the tie. So Piers said, fine, look, I'll tell you what. Here's my room key. Go up to my room, open the wardrobe. You'll find lots of ties. Go and borrow one of my ties. So I took his room key. I went up to his palatial suite, opened the wardrobe. He was always beautifully dressed, Piers. And in the wardrobe, there was this was for a 2-day Formula 2 race, but there were rows of suits and beautiful silk ties and so on. So I selected a tie, tied it round my neck. I mean, it's rather like, the T-shirt you're wearing.
Yeah, just with a tie kind of.
I just put it round. And I went down and had my dinner with him. And the maitre d' saw I was wearing a tie and there's nothing he could do about it. And a few months later, Piers was dead.
Yes, it's Zandvoort, yeah. So, it's kind of lovely to hear that about him, because I know he was a great friend of Sir Frank Williams, wasn't he? And
absolutely. Yeah.
As I've mentioned in the past, I mean, that hit, about 20 miles that way is Didcot and Wantage, where Williams are now based. They've always been my team. I've always had a soft spot for them. This chap up here, Nigel Mansell, was the guy who got me into F1 type thing. And
yeah,
it's just lovely hearing firsthand stories about people who were so involved with Williams. And it's lovely to hear that he was that kind of a guy.
Yeah. So. Frank was absolutely extraordinary because although he was dreadfully disabled by his accident, the brain, and to talk to, there was never a second of regret or bitterness or anything like that, because Frank only looked forward. There's nothing he could do about the accident. So he just carried on living his life. There were various alterations he had to do about logistics and so on, but he just carried on.
Yeah.
And he always wanted to know what was going on. And because I was one of these dreadful journalists hanging around listening to what he used to come over to me and say, what's going on, ST? What's just happened? What's the latest, ST? He always wanted to know. He always knew much more than me, but he thought there might be a little bit of gossip, a little bit of, sort of sponsor who's unhappy with the team. I might be able to get in there. He was always kind of ducking and diving and wheeler dealing.
That's amazing.
He was amazing, and he never changed. I mean, the last time I saw him, I did a lunch with him actually, which of course wasn't a lunch because he couldn't eat normally. But we went and sat in his office, and he was charming, and I mean, this was probably not that long before he died.
Right.
And he was weak, he was terribly compromised, but you would never think he was good humoured, he was entertaining, he was sharp as a tack, he was just a wonderful man.
So that's lovely. I mean, he's one of my heroes, absolutely. And I do remember seeing on the documentary about him and Williams. It was just the most. I found it a remarkable response. It was this one of the first interviews he did after his accident when he came back at British Grand Prix, and then it was might have been Germany the following race, and he was being interviewed, and then they asked him about the accident, and he goes, "Well, I don't remember too much about it. I kind of remember this and this and this." And he said, "Well, you'd better speak to Peter Windsor about the details because he was also in the car." He said, but then I was told that I wasn't going to be able to walk again, which is terribly unfortunate. But life goes on, and I just thought, what an incredible outing. He described it as terribly unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. I was. Yeah.
Amazing, just an amazing guy. Very cool. I'm aware of the time and keeping people too late. I mean, I'm fine. I'm sure they are as well. But where are we? Comment from someone on YouTube. Oh, here we are. Paul and Liz tuning in on YouTube. It says, "Do you have any stories of Joe Siffert and the great team owner Rob Walker?" Joe Siffert, that was another terrible loss, wasn't it? Brands.
Well, I have to tell you, if you get me started on Rob Walker, it's going to be a very long night. What's wonderful about Rob was, I mean, as you know, he raced before the war. When he got married, his wife said, "I'm only going to marry you if you give up racing. I'm not going to be married to a dead racing driver." So he became an entrant. And obviously with the Johnny Walker whiskey money, he had lots of money. And he was a wonderful entrant for a long time. Of course, we know all about Stirling Moss, that wonderful Argentine Grand Prix victory, and Stirling winning several Grand Prix, 2 Monacos, Nürburgring, and so on for him. And him Stirling saying, I never want to drive for another driver. I never want to drive for another team except Rob Walker. Stirling Moss could have had his pick of any team because he was the best. But he said, I only want to drive for Rob Walker because Rob was such a lovely man. He and Stirling never had a contract. It's just a handshake. Wow. After Stirling had his accident, obviously Rob had other drivers, Joe Siffert, Graham Hill. But after Rob Walker stopped, he missed Formula One. He still wanted to have a reason to go to Formula One. So amazingly, he became a journalist. I mean, he didn't need the journalist's pay, but he wanted to have a reason to go to Grand Prix and a job tank. So he used to come to Grand Prix as the Grand Prix editor of the American magazine Road and Track, which meant he was one of the journalists. So we all hung around. Rob was always staying in a rather nicer hotel than we were, but we would still have dinner together. And he adored Joe Siffert. They were a wonderful pair. He always called Siffert Seppi, my dear Seppi. And he adored him. And I remember seeing when Joe Siffert was killed at Brands Hatch in the BRM in that October Formula One non-championship race. Rob was there with one of his cars not being driven by Siffert, because Siffert was by then at BRM. But I knew something had happened. There had been a big accident, plumes of smoke, and I rushed down the pit lane to try and see what the hell was going on. And walking towards me was Rob with tears rolling down his cheeks, just sort of blindly walking along. And that's what I remember, because I knew that Rob adored Seppi. Seppi was a great wheeler dealer. He had a business in Switzerland buying and selling old racing cars. And, you know, he was a pretty hard operator. And Rob said one of the difficulties was that he always had, as Rob would put it, trouble was with Seppi. He always had one wife too many. One would always be trying to hide one when there was another one coming in. Got into terrible trouble. Siffert was a lovely character. And of course, a wonderful sports car driver. One of my favourite motor racing photographs of all time is when both Pedro Rodriguez and Joe Siffert were both driving for John Wyer in the Porsche 917s, the real orange Porsche 197s, and it's taken at Spa just after the start of the 1,000 kilometres. And the
Okay.
two 917s are coming down the hill into Eau Rouge, and they're actually touching because neither Pedro nor Seppi will lift off. I mean, Pedro, another magical man,
Yeah.
incredible guy. Pedro
Wow.
Rodriguez, what a hero.
Oh,
And
amazing. That's
Pedro, he was a great Anglophile. I mean, he was extremely Mexican, but he had an English girlfriend. I think there was a wife in Mexico, but there was an English girlfriend.
right. Okay.
He drove a 15-year-old Bentley, and out of the car, he wore a deerstalker hat, because he thought, this must be terribly English. That I knew not to be English. But God, when he got in the car, he was amazing. I love sports car racing every bit as much as Formula One.
Yes.
And one of the great races for me was the BOAC 1000 at Brands Hatch. Was it, one of your highly educated listeners will tell me, I think it was 1970, Porsche 917s,
Yeah.
and Pedro Rodriguez, it was pouring with rain, and the race started, and at the end of lap one, a guy called Barry Smith, whom everybody's forgotten, in a Lola T70, spun on the start-finish straight, and the car ricocheted between the banks and the barriers and so on, spreading, disintegrating. So in those days, they didn't stop the race. Races weren't stopped. There was the track completely blocked by bits of Lola T70. The race went on. It was a yellow flag, and people picked their way through the wreckage and then drove just as fast around the rest of the track. But it was the end of lap one, so everybody was still bunched up together after the start. Yellow flags were waving as you came into clearways. And Pedro Rodriguez, who I think was in about fourth place, overtook someone, which you can't do under a yellow flag.
Right.
So Nick Sarrett, who was the clerk of the course, wonderful man, he ran the BRSCC, he was about 6'5" tall. And however famous the racing driver was, Nick was the boss. And he black flagged Pedro. So Pedro had to come into the pits, furious. And the little gull-wing door of the 917 was opened. And Nick Sarrett towering above him with the black flag in his hand. And with the shaft of the black flag, Pedro was sitting in the cockpit, sullenly staring straight ahead. And Nick, with the flagpole, went on his head, "Don't do that again," and then slammed the door, and Pedro shot off, fishtailing down the pit lane. And of course, by now he was at the back of the field.
Amazing.
And it was pouring with rain. It was incredibly slippery. You know what a difficult car the 917 was, particularly around a tight circuit like Brands Hatch. And it was a 6.5 hour race. And I think he won by about 4 laps. I mean, he was just storming through the field.
Wow.
Pedro was a hero. Lovely,
amazing.
Wonderful.
I just love that sort of like an old school teacher telling off a kid at school, wasn't he? Don't you?
Exactly.
That's lovely. So I can't hear from like Darren Morley. He says, didn't they use that clip? I guess this is the one about ricocheting down the straight at Brands. He says, didn't they use that clip in the film Le Mans? Tell you what, I think they might have done. This new Steve McQueen film. They may well. I mean, they did something similar.
The Lola T70 accident that happened at Le Mans, they had a Lola T70 body, T70 Coupe Mark IIIB body, and they had it on some sort of slave chassis. And McQueen's sort of props man built this extraordinary, I think like a cannon, and it was like a huge kind of spring-loaded thing. I don't know what it was powered by. And they put the T70 crossways along this, and then they just fired the T70 across into the trees. And that shot is in the Le Mans film.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's cool. Oh, I like that. That's a big takeaway from this evening. That's great. I did see another comment here. Very quick. I just want to fast forward a little bit here. Someone did put on YouTube. It says, just going back to Jochen Rindt. It says, didn't Jochen refuse to drive the Lotus 4-wheel drive car and called it a death trap? I think that was.
That's quite likely. I mean, I remember it was the
Yeah,
Type
it's one of those things that
62.
have been read about, I think.
Yeah, I know John Miles, who subsequently became a very good motoring journalist. He was a very good technical writer, and he walked away from Formula One after Jochen Rindt's accident. And I know he had to drive the Lotus 63 and said it was horrible. But your listener may well be right. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if Jochen hated that four-wheel drive car. I mean, Jochen's relationship with Colin Chapman was always very, very kind of difficult.
From what I can gather, it always came across as being quite fractious.
Another Jochen Rindt story. When he first came into the Lotus team, he'd been at Brabham. He was at Cooper, and then Brabham, and then finally ended up at Lotus and was very quick. But Dennis Jenkinson, the wonderful Dennis Jenkinson, who was the Grand Prix writer on motorsport, the famous little bearded man who went with Moss in the Mille Miglia, and was a great writer and a wonderful observer of what went on in Formula One, and wrote as he found, didn't mind upsetting people. And he wrote, after Jochen had led a Grand Prix and had got off or something and gone on, he said, if Jochen Rindt wins a Grand Prix, I'll cut my beard off. He'd always had a beard all his life, long beard. So, of course, everybody read this. We all told Jochen that Dennis Jenkinson had written this. Jochen was extremely annoyed by it. Well, Jochen then won the American Grand Prix at Watkins Glen. And on Autosport, we had a wonderful cartoonist, a chap called Don Grant, who was actually the youngest son of Gregor Grant, who'd started the magazine. He was a brilliant cartoonist. And his cartoons were wicked and very clever. And he did a cartoon which had Jochen Rindt, very tall and thin, Dennis Jenkinson, whom he'd drawn as Toulouse-Lautrec, little tiny man with a big beard, and Jochen Rindt had a huge pair of scissors and was sort of descending on this little bearded man. And I had the original artwork of this because obviously Donny had drawn it and brought it in and we put it in the magazine. So I put it in a cardboard tube. It was about this big. I put it in the cardboard tube and sent it to Jochen. And Jochen wrote back, said, "Thank you very much for sending that. I opened it very carefully, that cardboard tube, in case Dennis Jenkinson's beard shavings fell out."
Oh, that's a lot. I do love that kind of beard. It just put me in mind very quickly. Was it John Watson when he won for Penske?
Quite right.
In Austria, and he said that if he won, he'd shave his beard off, and he was sitting at breakfast the following day having won, and Roger was like, "Where's John?" Didn't recognise him because he had no beard.
Yeah, and it was funny because I mean, in the sort of 60s and 70s, beards were quite rare. Now more men have beards than don't. But John was always, John always stood up because he was this strange Irishman with a beard. And in fact, a friend of mine who loves long words discovered that there's this splendid adjective to describe somebody who has a beard, which is barbiferous. And so we described John Watson in the race report as the barbiferous John Watson. And John rang up and said, "What the hell does that mean?"
Barbiferous. That's very good. I was
Well,
going to
yeah,
trim mine, but I might not bother
you're
now.
barbarous, you see.
Yeah,
You
I was
never
going to
know.
trim mine, but I think I might not bother now. It's pretty good. I quite fancy being barbiferous. So, great. I just want to touch on something here. You mentioned Dennis Jenkinson. Now, I know that obviously Sterling won was it the 55 Amelia with him.
Yeah.
Cool, I had to dig deep in my brain there with him. Obviously, the Mille Miglia was it for is it Brescia down the east coast, sort of across to Rome and back up again, isn't it? That was the
Absolutely.
original
Through quite a
course.
lot of mountains as it went. Yeah.
Yeah, and
1,000
it was
miles.
like a day race, and he won it and everything. I know that you ended up doing the modern version, didn't you, of the race with Sir Sterling? Was it 95?
It was. You're very well informed. Well, what happened
95.
was
So I see the
it
internet's a lovely thing. You can research all kind of stuff. It's great. But obviously it's now a 4 day rally now, isn't it? It isn't the 1 day thing
it
anymore.
is. It is. But
But you ended up doing it.
it's still on the same road.
Yeah.
And I mean, what happened was that it, the 300 SLR with 722 on it, Mercedes nowadays use it a lot, for publicity and so on. But in the 90s, they hadn't really started to do that very much. But I realized in 1995 that it was 40 years since Moss had won the Mille Miglia in the 300 SLR. So I rang Sterling up and I said, it's 40 years. You and Jenks should really get onto Mercedes, get them to send the 300 SLR down to Brescia, and you should do the Mille Miglia. So he said, good idea, boy. I'll have a word with Jenks. And he rang me back the next day and said, well, I've talked to Jenks. And Jenks, being Jenks, has said, what the hell would I want to do that for? Poncing around with a lot of rich old men in Ferraris. I've done the real thing. I don't need to do that. So Sterling said, you better come. So I did the Mille Miglia in the 300 SLR. And as you say, it's a 3-day rally now. But the road is still the same. And you still go through these villages and these crowded city streets with walls of people, 1 million people watch it, all the way from Brescia through the mountains down to Rome and back again. And it was 3 of the most amazing days of my life.
Fantastic. I mean, I can only imagine what it must have been like sharing the car with Sir Sterling. I mean, because I guess he was within his 60s then, wouldn't he? But I guess he still had it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, if you've got time, I will tell you, it's a rally.
Please do.
Sterling, even though it was meant to be, a bit of a jolly, Sterling took everything terribly seriously, so competitive. I've been in the supermarket shopping with Sterling, and he wants to get to the front of the queue. He's with the trolley, he's going quicker down the aisles than anybody. That's just the way he is.
Oh, I love that.
So you weren't allowed to use modern navigating equipment. You had to have old-fashioned stopwatches. So I had these stopwatches, I had the route, and every time you got to a control, you were docked 1 point if you were 1 second early or 1 second late. It was that accurate. And I was doing my best to try and, I'm a hopeless navigator, and I was doing my best to make it work. And the weather was terrible. And my notes were all turning to pulp, and it was awful. But because Sterling was hurrying in this magnificent straight 8 300 SLR, everywhere we were going, we always got there early. And we would stop about 20 yards before the finish line. And Sterling, he had a pair of those sort of air covers that you get for long distance flights in cover his eyes, because that was the way he could deal with the autograph hunters without being rude to them. He'd just put them on and go to sleep. And I would watch the watches, and I'd have to wake him up, start the car, and then get over the line to the second. So it was all a bit rough and ready, but we were up in a little mountain village, and we were cold, shivering cold, we were tired, we were hungry, we were dirty, and we were early. again. And I said I shouted up to him. The thing was incredibly noisy. It's got huge open exhausts just by the passenger side. And I shouted up to Sterling, "We're early, we can stop for a coffee." So he drove the 300 SLR up onto the pavement in this little country village up in the mountains. And we went in, and of course all the locals, Sterling Mas, so they all knew who he was, the 300 SLR sitting outside. And we had a coffee and had a pee and kind of got a bit cleaned up and got back into the car and off we went again. And when I got into the car, I suddenly realised, shit, I've done the sums completely wrong. And we've now got 23 minutes to do the next 27 miles. And this was through the mountains. We were going down a mountain pass. And I thought, God, he's going to be furious. So I sort of shouted up to him, and he gave me a filthy look. And then he kind of settled back, the old Sterling Moss, fingertips on the wheels.
Yeah.
And he really went for it. And it was raining, and we were coming down the mountains on this mountain pass. No ABS, so you get the wheels up to the brakes up to locking. He was just tapping the brake pedal. I was watching the master at work.
Wow.
And as I say, we had 23 minutes to do 27 miles, but we didn't quite do it. We did it in, I think, we had 23 minutes to do 27 miles. That's right. Well, we did it in about 24 and a half minutes. And
averaging about 70.
Yeah, we obviously had lots of penalties. And we got over the line and we switched off and took our helmets off. And I thought, I'm going to get the biggest bollocking ever here now. I said to Sterling, I'm so sorry. And he said, don't worry about it, boy. I rather enjoyed that.
Oh, wow.
Wonderful,
Wow.
wonderful man.
That must have been incredible. Just watching him do his thing, wow. Amazing. Okay, well, I've got to take one more thing from the comment section, then I need to. We're going to have to skip over your books, I'm afraid, because it's just time for another day. But very quickly, stories of Gilles Villeneuve. Do we have any? I mean, I think we automatically focus on those who are sadly no longer with us, especially those of us who I was only 15 months old when Gilles was very sadly lost. Any stories of Gilles?
Well, I didn't know Gilles particularly well. I knew his son quite well, but Gilles was particularly friendly with Nigel Roebuck, great writer on Sport. But Gilles was he was like a driver born out of his time. He should really have been a racer in the 20s or the 30s.
Right.
He didn't care about the danger. He just cared about the joy of driving quickly. And he was the most friendly, happy-go-lucky, smiling, sweet man until Didier Pironi shafted him at Imola.
I was going to say, was this Imola? Yeah, okay.
And we all know the story. A lot of the cars weren't there because there was some now going on. So Ferrari were going to finish 1 or 2. And they agreed between them how they were going to do it. And then Didier Pironi broke their agreement. And it was Villeneuve was so surprised. I mean, he didn't think that human beings were nasty like that. He was such a kind of genuine fellow, almost naive, and it absolutely shocked him. And he stopped smiling. And 2 weeks later, we were all at Zolder, and Pironi was good. He was quick, and Pironi set a good time in qualifying. And Villeneuve went out determined to beat it.
Yeah.
And he came over that brow, this of Zolder, that brow at the back.
It was Jochen Mass, wasn't it?
Jochen Mass, being, perfectly sensible. Jochen Mass was having set his time, he was driving back to the pits quite slowly, and Villeneuve couldn't avoid him, and that was the accident. If you were at I can't remember which of the evenings I've just done with Derek Warwick where he described it. It might have been the one you were at Brooklands.
Yes, it was. Yeah, he did mention it there. Yeah,
Derek was the next car along.
Mm.
He came along when it just happened, and Villeneuve was sprawled in the fence, and he had to kind of deal with it, which was horrible for him. But Gilles was an old-fashioned racing driver who just did it for the joy. And that's why I feel he really belonged better in the 1920s or 1930s. He was a wonderful man. His son was very different and quite a complicated character, partly because, of course, he was only a small boy when his father was killed.
Yes.
And that really affected how he set about life. But, you know, he won the championship and then he went away. Good for him.
Yeah, and he obviously won IndyCar Championship and Indy 500 and all that as well. Yeah, no, that's lovely. I just want to say again, that evening with Derek Warwick and your good self, and like David Tremaine was there, and obviously Dick Bennett was there, and it was honestly, I just want to say it was a fantastic evening for from both you and from Derek. And I put actually up on my own social media page. I just said, I can't believe I've just spent the evening with these people, because they're all these incredible people that I remember growing up, speaking to, and all of a sudden I'm in the same room as them. So yeah, thank you for that. It was a wonderful evening. Goodness me. Oh, what we got? Oh, someone's mentioned about Stefan Beloff. Okay, last one, Stefan Beloff. Again, another amazing driver lost. Probably the biggest what if of a generation, perhaps. I think Stefan, wasn't he?
Yes, I mean, I've talked to Jackie Ickx about Stefan Beloff because, I mean, obviously Beloff was killed making a passing move on Jackie Ickx, which would never have come off. And Ickx said he was a nice lad, terribly quick, but quicker than his experience, I think was the way Jackie put it. And I think if he'd lived, but also if he'd it sort of sounds trite to say if he'd calmed down, but I think if he'd just been able to channel his speed into, if he'd sort of thought about it a bit more, which he would have done as he got more experienced. I think, if you like, he was too fast, too young, but very talented.
Yeah, and obviously we know that he was it Michael Schumacher regarded him as his hero, which is fairly fairly impressive, isn't it? Okay, guys, thank you for the questions and the comments. It's absolutely fantastic. And we've got people saying thank you very much. Lovely. Thank you, Katie. Nice comment from Katie saying it's been a good evening. Thank you. Just quickly, we've got to talk about the Stovebolt special. You mentioned it earlier, the car. We spoke briefly about it at Brooklands. It's Sir Sterling's old car, isn't it?
It is. It's one of the HWM had three works cars in 1950, which was when Sterling, the young Sterling Moss, joined them. He was 20 at the start of that year. And he actually drove all three of the works cars because they swapped between the different cars. But I wrote a book about HWM.
Yes.
Because nobody had sort of done it, so I thought, well, I'd better. And I thought, well, they only made 19 cars. It'll probably be a 3-month job and a 180-page book. Well, it ended up merely because the research was so fascinating and so many stories came out. It ended up 2 volumes and about 500 pages.
Wow.
But anyway, yes, Sterling drove that car in 1950. Had his first bad accident in it. He was leading the Ferraris in the Naples Grand Prix, and a back marker moved across on him and put him off. And he hit a tree, and his head smashed against the top of the tonneau cover, and knocked out all his front teeth.
Oh.
And of course, his father was a dentist and made him some false teeth, which he then wore for the rest of his life. But when I bought the car, I said to him, Sterling, I've just bought the car that you crashed at Naples in 1950. And he said, jolly good shave. Why? Have a look under the seat. You'll probably find my front teeth. But anyway, the car,
Wonderful.
by a circuitous route, which I won't bother you with, ended up in America because it had a part in the sort of 1950s equivalent of Rush. It was a film about Grand Prix racing. It was made in Hollywood, starring Kirk Douglas.
Douglas, I'm sure I've seen it.
And Kirk Douglas drove my car. And then when the film was finished, it was bought by a West Coast racer called Tom Carstens, who put a small block V8 Chevy in it. Okay. And the small block V8 Chevy had only just come out, and it had been used in drag racing, and it had been used in oval racing. But my car was the first car to use it for circuit road racing, and of course the small block Chevy has. Well, it's still winning races, so I like to say it all started with my car. And anyway, I love it dearly. I've owned it now for about 25 years, and it's been raced all its life. And I don't like trailers, so I drive it on the road. It's kind of marginally road legal, and I drive it to hill climbs. I've raced it in Australia at Phillip Island.
Oh, what a circuit that is!
I've raced it at Laguna Seca in California.
Wow.
And I've driven, probably in the 25 years I've had it, I've probably done about 40,000 road miles in it. And wow. It's a magical road car because it's very small, it's very light, it's got 400 horsepower. So what more do you need?
That will do, won't it? I mean, God, and on top of that, it does look absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful looking thing. So yeah, very, very cool. Okay. Right. Okay, here we go. That's how it should be. Used, loved, and raced. So much better than gathering dust in a garage somewhere. Absolutely right. Absolutely agree. These things are made to be used. Okay, very quickly. One thing I did want to ask you. We mentioned you've put out, was it 6, 7 books? I think. Have you ever thought about doing or getting someone to do a book about your life? Because I think that would be a fabulous read.
Well, I certainly wouldn't ask somebody else to do it because I'm not a writer.
Not even Mr. Tremaine. I'm sure he'd be happy
to.
No,
I'd rather do it myself. But
good.
People do say that to me from time to time, but I don't know. I mean, I've been in the perfect position of a journalist. Of how can I put it? You do everything slightly at second hand if you're a journalist. You're hearing about other people's stories, which is great, and that's what I love to do. But I mean, there aren't really stories I can tell about myself because I haven't done anything interesting. It's the other people I talk to who've done interesting things. So I don't know if I feel if I wrote a book, it would be terribly self-indulgent. And I don't know if people want to read about what a journalist's done. They want to read about what the real people have done. I mean, I ghost wrote one of Stirling Moss's autobiographies, which was a wonderful experience, great to do. And I can tell you this because, I mean, you know what a ghostwriter basically writes the book. I mean, there are degrees of it. I think Derek Warwick had an awful lot to do with this book.
Yeah.
David Tremaine did a wonderful job, but I mean, it really was Derek.
Yeah, I've actually got a copy just over there, and it's from that night at Brooklyn, and it's fabulous.
I mean, if you are a ghostwriter, the skill is to try to catch the sort of tone of voice of the person that you're ghosting. But anyway, I did this thing with Sterling. It was a highly pictorial biography. My racing life, but it had a lot of words in it as well. And when I'd finally got the whole manuscript finished, I rang Sterling up and said, look, it's all finished. The publishers want it in 10 days. So I'm going to bring it round to you in Shepherd Street, and you're going to have to read it. Just if there's anything you don't like or anything you think you would rather me do different, let's do it. As Selling said, don't bother to do that, boy. He said, I don't read books. I'll wait till the movie comes out.
I love
That's
that approach.
No, I don't know. I sort of somehow feel that a book about myself, if I'd won the World Championship, or if I designed the Mini, or if I climbed Everest, you know what I mean? I've just been a lucky guy who's been able to spend my life watching and listening and talking about and writing about the stuff I love. And it doesn't get better than that, really.
Yeah, it's a lovely life to have lived, I'm sure. And from by the looks of it, I think a lot of people would be interested in a book of yours, but obviously we can leave that one open.
Maybe I'm not working on one yet. Let's put it that way.
No, fair enough. Okay, I've got two horrible questions for you just to finish up. The very final two, because we've run over as we always do, and I'm apologies we've kept you in the evening. However, this is a terribly difficult question. Firstly, we've got John Cavill saying thank you for a wonderful 3 hours. Thank you, John. And he agrees that the night at Brooklands was wonderful. It really was. It was a superb evening. Thank you, John. Good to hear from you, and good to see you at Brands the other week as well. Thank you. Okay, two shocking questions. Have you got a favourite car, racing car, as a fan or to drive or whatever? Have you got a favourite car of all time? I think a lot of us have a few that we can't choose from. Do you have one?
Well, I'm going to give you a rather predictable answer. It's my HWM. It's my favourite car. I love it dearly. I hope I can keep it forever.
I thought it might be.
There are cars that have Formula One cars that have hugely impressed me, and which I think have done the most wonderful job. But they're not cars I could drive. Probably my favourite sports racing car is the D-Type Jaguar, and I have been lucky enough to drive a few D-Type Jaguars. I love my HWM. That's if all the other cars disappeared, I would like my HWM.
That's a perfect answer. Absolutely love that. And okay, this is a shocking question. I ask it to all the drivers who have, about who they've raced against or who they shared the track with and everything else. And it's a horrible question. I ask it to everyone. I don't know why, because it's an absolute rotter. But is there anyone that you have, obviously, I ask drivers who they've raced against, is there anyone that you've seen in your many years of following motorsport and loving it and reporting on it, who stands out as maybe not being the best, but just someone who has impressed you immensely? Or is there anyone who you think they were something else?
Well, I'm afraid that's also got a very predictable and very easy answer.
Nothing wrong with that.
Which is the man that I first saw race on Easter Saturday 1952 in the rain at Castle Combe. The man, I remember saying to him, I was very, very lucky that I was Sterling Moss's fan for 60 years and his friend for 30, because I started to do bits of work with him probably in the 80s. And we just became very good mates. And he and Susie, his wife, and my wife and I, we used to go around together, and we went to places together, and we laughed, and he told all his stories. And then I did quite a lot of public events with him, because he hated making speeches, but he didn't mind telling stories and chatting if he had somebody to, keep him going. So I used to do that with him a lot. He was a wonderful man. I think he was certainly the best racing driver of his day. And I think he was one of the best racing drivers of all time.
I think that's the perfect way to finish it. One of the greatest ever, and certainly one of the greatest from our little country that we have here. Absolutely wonderful. Firstly, guys, thank you so much for all the questions and the comments and for everyone for tuning in. There's almost 300 of you tuning in, which is wonderful. Thank you very much for all the support. But of course, the biggest thanks to you, Simon. Thank you so much for coming on. I was amazed when you said yes, and I've been looking forward to speaking to you ever since. It's been a real privilege. But
well,
thank you.
I hope your audience out there have been happy with it.
Well, from the comment section, they're very happy from what I can see, which is wonderful. And from a personal point of view, it's been absolutely brilliant speaking with you. Something I never thought I'd do. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay. Very, very grateful. Guys, we're announcing another chat tomorrow evening. So tune in for that, and we will see you very, very soon. Thanks very much, everyone.